The sun hung low in the sky, casting long, eerie shadows across the streets of the small town. I had recently taken over the local restaurant, eager to bring my culinary expertise to the community. The previous owner had left behind a collection of recipe books, and I was excited to explore them. One afternoon, as I was flipping through an old, leather-bound recipe book, a folded piece of paper slipped out from between its pages. Unfolding it, I read the hastily scribbled message, "Don't cook from this." The note sent a shiver down my spine. The handwriting was shaky, as if written in haste or fear. I looked around the empty kitchen, suddenly feeling very alone. The hum of the refrigerator seemed louder, the shadows darker. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was probably a joke or a warning about outdated recipes. But curiosity got the better of me. I began to read the recipe on the page the note had been marking. It was for a dish called the Chef's Last Supper. The ingredients were ordinary enough, but the instructions were odd. They were incredibly specific, detailing the exact time to add each ingredient, the precise temperature to cook at, and even the specific type of utensils to use. Feeling a mix of intrigue and defiance, I decided to prepare the dish. As I began, I felt an overwhelming sense of being watched. Every time I turned around, I half expected to see someone standing there, but the kitchen remained empty. As I followed the recipe, strange things began to happen. The lights flickered. The radio turned on by itself, playing an old, haunting tune. The air grew cold, and I could see my breath. I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence, but the feeling of dread grew stronger with each passing minute. When the dish was finally ready, it looked alive. The colors were too vibrant, the aroma too intoxicating. I felt drawn to it, compelled to taste it. But just as I was about to take a bite, the restaurant's back door slammed open. A disheveled man burst in, his eyes wild with fear. "Stop," he shouted, rushing towards me. "Don't eat it." I recoiled, dropping the plate. The man looked at the shattered dish and let out a sigh of relief. "Thank God," he whispered. He introduced himself as the previous owner of the restaurant. He explained that the recipe was cursed. Every chef who had prepared it had met a tragic end soon after. He had written the warning note after narrowly escaping death himself. I felt a mixture of relief and disbelief. The man apologized for not being more explicit in his warning and thanked me for not tasting the dish. He'd offered to buy the restaurant back, but I declined. The experience had shaken me, but I was determined to move past it. The next day, I burned the cursed recipe book and held a cleansing ceremony in the restaurant. Business boomed, and the dark events of that afternoon became a distant memory. But every now and then, when the sun casts long shadows and the air grows cold, I remembered the forbidden recipe and the man who saved me from its curse. And I'm reminded of the thin line between ambition and danger, and the importance of heeding warnings, no matter how mysterious they may seem. The world is a remarkably simple place when you're 5. Friends are made effortlessly, and loyalty isn't dependent on anything beyond the mutual love of some toy or TV show. So when my daughter Sarah first mentioned her new friend Tommy, I didn't think much of it. Imaginary friends are standard fare at her age, and it was healthy for her imagination. The first time I noticed something unusual was on a chilly Sunday evening. As I walked past Sarah's room, I heard her giggling. The sound of a child's laugh can be the most comforting thing, but this felt different, more secretive. I softly peeked into her room. She was sitting in a circle of toys, whispering. "Who are you talking to, sweetie?" I inquired. She looked up, her eyes wide and innocent. "Tommy." I smiled. "What were you two whispering about?" Sarah glanced to her side, as if waiting for Tommy's permission to tell. "He just tells me stories, Daddy, about the outside world. He says he has been everywhere." I chuckled. Sounds like a very adventurous friend. Things took a strange turn a few days later when I found her in the backyard, talking animatedly to a bush. When I asked her what she was doing, she claimed Tommy lived there. I just put it down to her vibrant imagination. It wasn't until she started revealing things she couldn't possibly know that the unease began. Sarah started sharing detailed accounts of places she'd never been. She mentioned a small toy shop in a town we'd never visited, a park with a blue and yellow swing set in another state, and an ice cream parlor where Tommy met another friend. Curious and admittedly a little concerned, I started looking up these places. To my shock, they all existed, exactly as Sarah described. As days passed, I began hearing hushed conversations late at night, long after Sarah should have been asleep. She talked about more places, more experiences, and about some man, a man Tommy was afraid of. One night, as I was getting water from the kitchen, I heard Sarah's voice from the living room. It was past her bedtime. I tiptoed to see who she was talking to. From my vantage, I saw her in dim light, holding hands with a tall, gaunt figure. The sight made my blood turn cold. Who was this? Gathering courage, I yelled, "Who are you?" The figure bolted out the back door. Sarah, startled, began crying. I ran to her, holding her tight, and called the police. The following investigation unraveled a series of horrifying truths. The man had been a drifter, traveling from town to town, using an intricate network of small underground spaces linked to our house. He befriended children, get close, learn their schedules, their lives. He had done it multiple times in different states, and now he was in our home, whispering stories of his travels through a vent in Sarah's room. The backyard bush? It concealed an entrance to this hideout. As for Tommy, the police found a set of old children's clothes in his underground lair, along with a diary detailing his travels. The last entry spoke of befriending a little boy named Tommy, who went missing in another state. The man was captured a week later, trying to enter another home in a neighboring state. Our family moved out of that house, trying to leave behind the shadows of that horrifying encounter. Sarah went to therapy, and over time, the whispers of Tommy faded. One evening in our new home, as we sat down for dinner, she looked at me and said, "Daddy, Tommy says thank you. He says he can rest now." I hugged her tight. The first hint that something was wrong came from the radio. Its tinny voice, usually the background hum to my deliveries, began crackling with urgency. Reports of mass protests, civil unrest, and violence painted a picture far removed from the tranquil early evening I had expected. As I approached the city's edge, my worn-out delivery van jutted over the cracked roads, and the sun began its descent, casting eerie shadows on the graffiti walls. The GPS indicated that my route was through the heart of the city. The thought weighed heavily on me, but I shrugged it off. After all, I had a job to complete. The scenes which greeted me downtown were beyond anything I had imagined. The city, always a buzzing hive of activity, had turned into a tempestuous sea of anger and chaos. The rioters' faces, contorted with rage, became clearer as I cautiously drove closer. Smoke billowed from burning cars, their crimson flames reflecting in my rear-view mirror, dancing like malevolent spirits. Streets that I had driven countless times, places filled with memories of casual conversations and regular customers, had transformed into war zones. I could hear screams, distant and then nearer, glass shattering, alarms wailing in protest. My grip on the steering wheel tightened. I had almost reached my destination when a large group blocked the road ahead, their faces hidden behind makeshift masks. I tried to reverse, but another group approached menacingly from behind, trapped. A tall, imposing figure broke away from the crowd and approached my window. "What's in the van?" he demanded. "Just some deliveries, man," I stammered, heart pounding against my ribs. Suddenly, the back doors of my van were yanked open. I heard rummaging, then a shriek. The figure at my window barked, "Everyone, back off." Confused, I turned to see a young woman no older than 20 emerging from the back of my van. She was one of the rioters, clutching one of the packages. "They're just books," she exclaimed, breathless, her voice echoing with disbelief. "It's all just books." The crowd was momentarily stunned. Then, almost as if the revelation had flipped a switch, the atmosphere changed. Faces softened. The tall man who'd initially approached me stepped forward. "I'm sorry," he muttered, extending a hand. "We thought you were carrying weapons or supplies for the police." The young woman handed back the package, her eyes now curious. "You're delivering books in the middle of this?" "They're for the children's hospital," I replied, the weight of the situation finally catching up with me, making my voice shake. "Stories for the kids who can't get out." Another man, older, with gray in his beard, stepped forward. "We'll escort you there," he said decisively, the earlier chaos seemingly forgotten. With their protection, my journey through the riot-torn city became eerily calm. The rioters cleared paths, and others joined our convoy, ensuring my safe passage. Arriving at the hospital, the children's wing was a haven of peace amid the chaos outside. As I unloaded the books, the initial group of rioters joined in, helping distribute them to eager young hands. The tall man, once so menacing, knelt by a young girl's bed, animatedly reading to her from a fairy tale book. The transformation was astounding. Returning to my van, the older man with the gray beard approached. "It's not safe out there. Stay here for the night," he urged. As I settled into the makeshift refuge, surrounded by the comforting hum of children engrossed in their tales, the city outside continued its tumultuous dance. But in that one corner, stories, not violence, ruled the night. The next morning, the sun's first rays pierced through the smoky haze. With a heavy heart, I resumed my journey. The rioting had subsided, but its scars remained. The difference, though, was the message I carried. Even in our darkest moments, hope can light the way. I've always had a penchant for old structures, colonial houses, abandoned factories, rusted railroad tracks. Their histories whispered secrets to me that I felt compelled to unravel. So when I found a crumbling old mansion at the edge of the city selling for an inexplicable bargain, my heart raced with excitement. After signing the deed, I began my renovation plans immediately. The first time I saw the house, the setting sun painted it in golden hues, its grandeur hiding the decades of neglect. Large bay windows looked down with blinded eyes, their glass shattered or frosted over with grime. The surrounding trees, ancient and gnarled, framed the house like silent sentinels. Inside was a labyrinth of rooms, each holding remnants of bygone days, rotting furniture, dusty portraits, and the stale air of confinement. As the days turned into weeks, I grew familiar with every nook and cranny, carefully restoring what was salvageable. Every wall I tore down, every floorboard I pried up, I felt closer to the house, as if it was slowly revealing its stories to me. However, there was one door that resisted all my attempts. Located in the farthest corner of the ground floor, it was made of thick, dark oak with a rusty, heavy padlock securing it. Curiosity gnawed at me. What secrets did this room hold? Why was it locked away? One evening, after a particularly tiring day of renovations, I sat down with a glass of wine, pondering that very door. Just as I was about to drift off to sleep, a thud echoed through the hallway. Startled, I sat upright, listening intently. Another thud, then the unmistakable sound of footsteps, growing fainter, heading towards the locked door. Fear and paranoia seized me. I wasn't alone in the house. I tiptoed to the front door, considering making a run for it, but something held me back. A need to know, a need to confront. Armed with a crowbar, I followed the sounds. To my shock, the padlock lay broken on the floor, and the door stood slightly ajar. Heart pounding, I pushed it open. What lay behind wasn't a room, but a set of old, creaky wooden stairs leading down into pitch darkness. The basement? How did I miss this during my initial exploration? Curiosity, again, overpowered my fear. I descended, guided only by the weak light of my cell phone. The basement was expansive, with arched stone ceilings and cobblestone floors. At the center, an ornate wooden table surrounded by chairs. On it lay old newspapers, dusty and yellowed with age, but the dates and headlines were shockingly recent. They spoke of disappearances in the city, the last one dated only a month ago. I gasped, feeling a cold breeze pass me. In the corner of the room, shackled to the wall, was a man, gaunt, dirty, with wild eyes that bore into mine. He whispered hoarsely, "You're not one of them, are you? Please help me." The implications crashed upon me. The locked door, the fresh newspapers, this man. Someone was using my house. But for what? Suddenly, footsteps echoed above, multiple pairs, growing louder. Panic surged through me. They were coming back. I fumbled with the man's shackles, finally freeing him. Together, we bolted up the stairs, barricading the door behind us. We fled the house, hiding in the nearby woods. The lights of multiple vehicles approached the mansion, their occupants carrying torches. It was some kind of syndicate, a group that had been using the mansion's hidden basement for their nefarious activities long before I arrived. Hours seemed like minutes, and the night wore on, each moment a stretch of terror. But as dawn approached, we heard sirens. The neighbors, alarmed by the unusual activity, had called the police. The syndicate was arrested, their reign of horror finally at an end. The man, Luke, had been their most recent captive. An investigative journalist, he'd gotten too close to the truth and was taken. When I moved to the small town of Dunbridge, it was to escape the clamor of city life. The quaint houses, large oak trees, and welcoming neighbors felt like a breath of fresh air. I had bought a little bungalow on Hawthorne Street, working remotely for a renowned publishing house. The first month was an idyllic blur of settling in, taking long walks, and occasionally dining out at the town's solitary cafe. Then came the first gift, a simple white rose left on my doorstep. No note, no clue about the sender. I'd assumed it was a friendly gesture from a neighbor. Over the next week, roses started appearing every day. Along with them came letters, scribbled on crumpled paper. I admire your beauty from afar. Your hair dances like the golden rays of dawn. It was poetic but odd. My unease grew when roses started appearing not only at my doorstep, but also on my work desk at home. It meant someone was entering my house when I was out. I reported it to the local police. They promised increased patrols, but admitted that without any direct threats, their hands were tied. The letters became more intimate and possessive. One morning, I found a locket with a strand of my hair inside. The accompanying note read, "You and I are bound forever." I felt watched, stalked, trapped. Every creak in my house, every rustle outside made my heart race. Jenny, my colleague, suggested I stay with her. "Maybe your stalker will back off if he thinks you're not alone," she said. I agreed, needing the company and reassurance. One evening, after a particularly distressing day, we ordered food. The delivery guy was a tall man, his eyes hidden behind thick glasses. He seemed to linger a little too long, staring at me. I felt uneasy, but brushed it off. Weeks passed. The gifts and letters continued but became more spaced out. It seemed as if my unknown admirer had grown tired, or maybe the move to Jenny's had thrown him off. I decided to return home after a month. The first day was uneventful. As days passed, the paranoia returned. Every night, I double-checked my locks and windows, ensuring I was safe. One evening, after returning from the store, I found my living room light on. I was sure I turned it off. My heart thudded in my chest as I approached. The room was empty, but on the table lay a rose and a note. "I missed you." Panicking, I called the police. They searched the house, finding nothing. "Maybe you forgot to turn off the light," the officer suggested. They left, urging me to consider security cameras. The next day, I decided to install cameras inside and outside my home. That night, I reviewed the footage, hoping to catch a glimpse of the stalker. Hours of mundane recordings flashed by until my living room camera revealed something chilling. The delivery guy from that evening at Jenny's stood at my window peering in. He attempted to open it but failed. Then he looked directly into the camera, his cold eyes sending a shiver down my spine. The following morning, I showed the footage to the police. They identified him as Edward Hayes, a man previously suspected of stalking, but never prosecuted due to lack of evidence. They arrested Edward later that day. The subsequent search of his home revealed a shrine dedicated to me, with photos, some taken from afar, others from inside my house. I learned that Edward was infatuated with me after that one delivery to Jenny's. He thought we shared a bond. My house being close to the cafe, he saw me regularly, fueling his obsession. I was relieved but deeply shaken. The quiet town of Dunbridge was supposed to be my haven, not a place of terror. The experience changed me. I became more guarded, more wary. But I also grew stronger, learning that while horrors may lurk in unexpected places, I had the resilience and support to overcome them. The clicking of the camera shutter pierced the silence of my apartment like a gunshot in the dead of night. My eyes flew open, heart racing as I scanned the dark room. Nothing looked out of place, yet my skin prickled with unease. Slowly, I sat up, listening intently. Only the hum of the AC and the pounding of my heart filled my ears. Just as I began convincing myself it was only a dream, a bright flash lit up the room. There was someone here with me, watching me as I slept, capturing my unconscious form on film. Bile rose in my throat, and I had to choke back a scream. Who would do something so twisted? I had no boyfriend, no crazy ex that would pull a stunt like this, and I always double-checked the lock before bed. My mind raced, trying to make sense of how someone could have gotten in. A noise from the closet snapped me to attention. Gripping the baseball bat that I kept by my nightstand, I slowly crept towards the source. The closet door was open just a crack and seemed to beckon me closer. I hesitated, then in one swift movement pulled the door open, bat raised and ready to strike. Only coats and shadows greeted me. Turning in a slow circle, I searched every nook and cranny of my apartment, finding no one. Yet the feeling of being watched persisted. I hurried to the front door to check the lock. Still securely fastened. The deadbolt too was engaged. No windows or balcony access. No signs of forced entry. So how was this psycho getting in to take pictures of me sleeping? A chill ran down my spine as a horrible thought emerged. What if he was already inside when I went to bed? I sank to the floor as the realization hit me. Some creep had been hiding in my closet, mere feet from where I lay vulnerable and unconscious. Bile rose in my throat as I imagined him leering over me, camera in hand, reaching out to touch me as I slept. I squeezed my eyes shut, hot tears spilling down my cheeks. My safety, my solitude, my sanity, all shattered by this stranger's twisted obsession. What did he want from me? Why me? I drew my knees to my chest, body quaking. I had to get out of here. But it was the dead of night, and I had no one to call for help. Seeking comfort, I pulled out my phone and began scrolling through old pictures, photos of happier times before I lost my job and found myself isolated in this apartment that now felt like a prison cell. My finger froze as I spotted something that turned my blood to ice. A close-up shot of my face as I slept. Heart hammering, I scrolled further. Each photo more chilling than the last. Dozens of images of me unconscious, some zoomed in, some full body. Many featured a shadowy figure standing over me. I flung the phone away and scrambled back against the wall, a scream tearing from my lips. The violation I felt shook me to my core. This monster hadn't just broken in to take demented photos. He was already here, living in my home, watching me day and night for who knows how long. I had to escape. Now, adrenaline flooded my veins as I leaped to my feet, throwing on clothes with shaking hands. I didn't bother to pack or even put on shoes despite the freezing temperatures outside. I just had to get out. I unlocked the 3 deadbolts on my door, movement stiff and fumbling. Any second I expected to feel his hands on my shoulders, pulling me back into the dark apartment that had become my prison. But as I turned the handle and let the door swing open, nothing stopped me. I stumbled out into the hallway, breath coming in ragged gasps. At this late hour, the halls were empty, filled only with menacing shadows. I broke into a run, bare feet slapping against the cold, hard floor, still unsure if I was being pursued. I raced for the stairwell, taking the steps 2 at a time before bursting through the exit door. The rush of cold night air felt like salvation. I paused only for a second to look back towards the building that had become my own personal hell. What I saw made my heart stop. In a 4th-floor window, a silhouette stood staring down at me. My mind spun. Had he been there all along? Peering out over the unsuspecting city, bile rose in my throat as I realized he was never in the apartment with me. He didn't need to be, when he could simply watch my every move through the lens of a camera. I took off, running and slipping on icy sidewalks. I had to find help to escape the nightmarish violation of my life. As I fled into the unknown, tears streamed down my face, and a chilling mantra repeated in my mind. He's always watching, always watching, always watching. In the waning light of dusk, the auto repair shop stood desolate at the edge of town, its rusted sign groaning with every gust of wind. The sun's final rays cast an eerie, almost spectral glow, making the shop's grimy windows and peeling paint seem even more foreboding. Inside, the overhead lights flickered, casting a dim, ghostly illumination. Alone in this unsettling atmosphere, I worked on an ancient set-in, its once vibrant paint now faded and chipped. The owner had complained about a malfunctioning radio, and given the car's age, it wasn't surprising. I turned the radio on, expecting the usual static of an old device. Instead, a deafening white noise filled the room, its intensity making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I tried tuning it, but the static was relentless. Frustrated, I switched it off and began to dismantle the dashboard. From the oppressive silence, a voice emerged, quivering with fear. If anyone can hear this, please, you have to help." I recoiled, my heart racing. The voice was unmistakably that of a young girl, and it dripped with raw terror, and it was emanating from the radio, which I was sure I had turned off. "My name is Emily," the voice continued, each word punctuated by sobs. "Someone's taken me. I don't know where I am. I found a way to send this message, but I'm so scared." A cold dread washed over me. This couldn't be a hoax, could it? The sheer terror in her voice was too genuine. "Emily," I whispered, even though I knew she couldn't hear me. "Try to stay calm." The static hissed for a moment before her voice returned, fainter this time. "It's pitch black. I think I'm underground. I can hear the muffled sounds of traffic. There's a sliver of light from a window, but it's out of reach." Panicking, I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my fingers trembling. I relayed the chilling message, and the dispatcher's voice betrayed her own alarm. She told me to stay put, and that they were on it. But then, the unmistakable sound of the garage door creaking open echoed through the shop, followed by slow, deliberate footsteps. My mind raced with horrifying possibilities. Was this the person responsible for Emily's plight? I quickly hid beneath the workbench, clutching a wrench for some semblance of protection. The footsteps grew louder until they stopped right next to the sit-in. A long, tense silence ensued, broken only by the soft crackle of the radio. Then, a familiar voice called out, "Is anyone here?" Peeking out, I recognized Officer Daniels, a local cop I'd seen around town. Relief washed over me. "I picked up the transmission in my patrol car," he said, his voice strained. "Stay here. We got a lead on the location." Days turned into weeks, and the town was abuzz with the story of Emily's mysterious message. I was swamped with reporters and curious townsfolk, all wanting to see the miracle radio. But the weight of that night hung heavily on me. I hadn't been the hero. I was just a witness to a chilling plea for help. Emily was eventually found and rescued, her abductor apprehended. The town celebrated her return, and her bravery became legendary. As the sun lazily rises over the sleepy suburb of Riverton, the quaint middle school nestled amongst tall oak trees begins to stir with life. Right in the heart of it all is the warm and welcoming classroom of Ms. Eleanor Simmons, a seasoned middle school teacher respected for her empathy and dedication. Each morning, she would arrange her desk with a cherished familiarity, arranging her colorful books and student projects. But on one dreary Monday morning, her usual routine was disrupted by an odd discovery. A small, ragged note slipped under her coffee mug. Her brows furrowed, perplexed, as she unfolded the grimy paper. "Remember what you did. You can't escape your past, Eleanor." A cold shiver ran down her spine, her chest constricting as her eyes darted across the eerily familiar handwriting. She dismissed it as a juvenile prank, yet an uncomfortable silence loomed, clawing its way into her mind. Each day, a new note found its way onto her desk, each more menacing than the last. "Tick-tock, Eleanor. Your past is catching up. The truth will come out." Each message was a jab at her sanity, turning her once safe haven into a place of haunting paranoia. Whispers of fear echoed in the halls, her heart pounding in rhythm with the ominous ticking of the clock on the wall. Her once vibrant classroom felt oppressive. The chalky smell of the blackboard and the coldness of the linoleum floors felt chilling. She reached out to the school authorities, but they were dismissive. insisting it was the work of mischievous students. But Eleanor knew better. The gut-wrenching dread consuming her was far too real. One day, she found herself locked in her classroom during recess. The once melodious laughter and chatter from the schoolyard now sounded like haunting echoes, a symphony of terror. Panic gnawed at her as she tried the door, her hands trembling, slick with perspiration. Suddenly, a note slid under the door, so fresh that the ink was still wet, staining her trembling fingers. "Found you." With a guttural scream, she pounded on the door, her voice swallowed by the thick walls of the classroom. Suddenly, she froze, the hair on the back of her neck prickling as she realized she wasn't alone. A gaunt figure emerged from the shadowy corner of the room, his eyes devoid of warmth, carrying an eerie familiarity that froze her blood. Her heart pounded as she recognized him. It was Jason, a former student who was expelled under mysterious circumstances years ago. The same student whose life she had unintentionally ruined by reporting suspicious behavior that turned out to be unfounded. As the horrifying reality settled in, she stared at him, his cruel smile reflecting the years of resentment and hatred. The years had not been kind to him. His haggard appearance and dark eyes were testament to a life gone wrong. "You remember now, don't you, Eleanor?" he rasped, stepping into the dim light, his cruel smile revealing a maw of decaying teeth. "You remember the life you ruined, the innocence you stole." Eleanor stood paralyzed, the ticking of the classroom clock echoing ominously. The morning light seeped through the blinds, casting grotesque shadows on Jason's distorted face. Summoning all her courage, she spoke, her voice trembling but resolute. "Jason, I'm sorry for what happened. I made a mistake. It was never my intention to ruin your life." Jason glared at her, his lips curling into a bitter smile. "Sorry won't bring back my lost years, Eleanor." "I know," Eleanor whispered, swallowing the lump in her throat. "But we can start mending things. We can try to correct the past, together." There was a tense silence. Eleanor could hear the ticking clock, the beating of her own heart. She could see the war within Jason, the anger, the hurt, the betrayal. It was a long, grueling minute before Jason's expression softened, the harsh lines of his face easing into something less menacing. Just then, the locked door creaked open as the janitor, having heard Eleanor's screams, came rushing in. Seeing the situation, he quickly dialed 911, and within minutes, the quiet school was swarming with the local police. Jason was taken into custody, and Eleanor was brought out of the classroom. Despite the shocking events, a wave of relief washed over her, knowing that Jason would get the help he needed and that her nightmare was finally over. The rain was pouring down in torrents, and the streets of New York City were nearly deserted. I had been driving my taxi for almost 12 hours straight, and I was eager to call it a night. Just as I was about to turn off my available sign, a man flagged me down. He was standing under the dim light of a street lamp, his silhouette barely visible through the heavy rain. He opened the door and slid into the back seat, his clothes dripping wet. "Drive," he said, his voice low and raspy. "Where to?" I asked, glancing at him through the rearview mirror. His face was obscured by the shadows, but I could make out a pair of intense, piercing eyes staring back at me. "Just drive," he repeated. I hesitated for a moment, then shrugged and started driving. The city's neon lights reflected off the wet streets, creating an eerie glow. The rain muffled all other sounds, and the only noise inside the cab was the rhythmic patter of raindrops on the roof. After a few minutes, the man finally spoke. "Take the next left," he instructed. I did as he said, turning onto a narrow, poorly lit street. The buildings on either side seemed to loom over the taxi, their windows dark and empty. "Stop here," he said suddenly. I pulled over to the side of the road, and he pointed to an old, abandoned building. "Wait for me," he said, opening the door and stepping out into the rain. "Keep the meter running." I watched as he approached the building, disappearing into the shadows. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled in my chest. It was just another fare, I told myself. Nothing to be afraid of. But as the minutes ticked by, my anxiety grew. What was he doing in there? Why had he brought me to this desolate place? Suddenly, the back door opened, and the man climbed back in, holding a small black bag. "Drive," he said, his voice even more urgent than before. I didn't ask any questions, I just drove. The rain was coming down even harder now, and the streets were slick and treacherous. I could barely see more than a few feet in front of me. "Turn here," he said, pointing to another narrow alley. I hesitated for a moment, then turned the wheel, the tires screeching on the wet pavement. The alley was even darker than the street we had just left, and I had to strain my eyes to see where I was going. Suddenly, the man shouted, "Stop." I slammed on the brakes, and the taxi skidded to a halt. The man opened the door and jumped out, leaving the black bag on the seat beside him. "Wait here," he said, disappearing into the darkness. I sat there, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to make sense of what was happening. What was in that bag? Why had he left it with me? Suddenly, I heard a shout, followed by the sound of running footsteps. I looked up to see the man sprinting towards the taxi, his face twisted in terror. Behind him, 3 figures emerged from the shadows, chasing after him. Without thinking, I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, and the taxi lurched forward. The man reached the car just in time, jumping in and slamming the door behind him. "Go," he shouted. I floored it, the tires screeching as we sped away from the alley. The 3 figures were left behind, their shouts fading into the distance. We drove in silence for a few minutes, both of us catching our breath. Finally, the man spoke. "Thank you," he said, his voice shaky. "You saved my life." I glanced at him in the rearview mirror, my heart still racing. "What happened back there?" I asked. He hesitated for a moment, then said, "I'm a journalist. I've been investigating a criminal organization for months. Tonight, I got a tip about a meeting in that abandoned building. I thought I could get some evidence, but they spotted me." I nodded, trying to process what he had just told me. "What's in the bag?" I asked. He opened it, revealing the camera and several rolls of film. "Photos," he said, "proof of their illegal activities." We drove in silence for a few more minutes, then he gave me an address. When we arrived, he handed me a wad of cash. "For your trouble," he said. I shook my head. "Just doing my job," I replied. Every morning, I woke to a mysterious gift. Each day it was the same. A white box, ribbon tied, left on the doorstep of my quiet suburban home. Inside was always something unremarkable, a trinket that would ordinarily be considered harmless. However, the regularity and anonymity of the sender turned this innocent act into a sinister obsession. I am Eleanor, a woman in her 30s, living alone, fiercely independent and cautious. My quiet life was shattered the day the first package arrived, bearing no return address, just my name, written in meticulous, handwritten script. The first contained a silver necklace with a butterfly pendant, delicate and beautiful, but its anonymous origins filled me with unease. I made inquiries, but the postman only shrugged. He didn't recall who gave him the package. Over the next week, more gifts arrived: a hairbrush, a scarf, an antique mirror. Each was accompanied by a note, a single handwritten compliment. "Your hair looks beautiful today. The scarf matches your eyes. You are the fairest of all." The compliments were unsettlingly specific, each one referencing something about my appearance from the day before. Someone was watching me, studying me. A creeping paranoia began to eat away at my sanity. Every passerby was a potential stalker. Every shadow seemed sinister. I filed a police report, but without tangible threats or harm. Their hands were tied. One day, as I returned from work, I found my house door ajar. Panic surged through my veins like liquid ice. I walked in, every footfall echoing loudly in my ears. My home was untouched, save for a box resting on the kitchen table, a note atop. "I prefer when you wear red." I looked down at my blue dress, a chill creeping down my spine. The intruder had been here in my sanctuary while I was away. I called the police again, but the intruder had left no trace. I changed my locks, installed security cameras, but the gifts kept appearing, now at my workplace. The notes grew more intimate, more demanding. The office receptionist didn't remember any stranger. Co-workers started whispering behind my back, adding humiliation to the bubbling cauldron of fear. One day, I received a box with a red dress. The note read, "Wear this tomorrow. I'd love to see you in red." I was petrified. Whoever it was knew my routine, my habits, my life better than anyone else. That night, I didn't sleep. The next day, I did the only unpredictable thing. I wore the red dress. The entire day, I felt eyes on me, an invisible weight constricting my lungs. As the clock ticked towards the end of my workday, I felt a shiver of anticipation. Would something happen today? Walking to my car in the near-empty parking lot, I felt the prickling sensation of being watched. Suddenly, there was a hand on my shoulder. I spun around, heart pounding, only to find a co-worker, Peter. "Sorry, didn't mean to startle you, Eleanor," he said. "Just wanted to say, you look good in red." A strange relief washed over me, followed by the shock of his words. It was Peter. Shy, introverted Peter who barely spoke 2 words to anyone. It was all too surreal. Without thinking, I asked him, "Peter, did you send the gifts?" He seemed taken aback. Then his face fell into an apologetic grimace. "I'm sorry if I scared you, Eleanor," he confessed. I admire you." The police were called, and Peter was escorted away, leaving behind a trail of shock, gossip, and a lingering sense of violation. The ordeal was over, but the aftertaste of fear remained. My everyday life, once so peaceful, had turned into a horror show. I learned that monsters didn't just hide under beds or in closets. Sometimes they hid behind friendly faces, buried under a crush, masked by an obsession. The oppressive silence of my hotel room hung over me like a shroud. Stale, chilling air prickled the bare skin of my arms, the sole illumination, a halo from the flickering screen of my laptop. I was still coming to terms with my recent dismissal. As a journalist, my tenacious spirit had been my sword and shield, yet it was also my downfall. My critical piece on the corporate giant, Meisler Incorporated, had resulted in their wrath and my subsequent job loss. Since then, my room became my sanctuary, my prison, a graveyard of dead aspirations. My life revolved around job searches, blank Word documents, and cups of cold coffee. One evening, while scouring the net for freelance gigs, an anonymous email popped up. The subject was, "Is this you?" The innocuous question piqued my curiosity. Clicking on it, I was met with a link to a dark web forum. My instincts screamed at me to close it, to delete the email. Yet the mystery tugged at the journalist in me, and curiosity compelled me to click on it. My breath hitched as I stared at the images that loaded on the screen. Pictures of me, high resolution, capturing intimate moments of my life. There I was at the grocery store, hunched over a cart of canned soup and ramen. There I was at the coffee shop, my face illuminated by the cold glow of my laptop. There was even a picture of me brushing my teeth, taken through my hotel room window. The invasion of my privacy was horrifying. My stomach churned with disgust as I scrolled through more photos, each increasingly intimate and invasive. My safe haven, my hotel room, no longer felt secure. Paranoia gnawed at my mind as every creak, every rustle of the wind became a potential intruder. I double, then triple-checked the locks on my doors and windows. The dark corners of my room seemed to seethe with unseen threats. Every shadow morphed into a hideous, leering face. Every mirror seemed to reflect an unseen observer. Days blurred into nights. As I obsessively monitored the forum for new posts, I was terrified yet couldn't tear myself away. The idea of contacting the hotel management or the police crossed my mind, but the thought of them not believing me, or worse, blaming me for the situation, kept me silent. One day, a new batch of photos appeared. Photos of me in my room, curled up on the couch, my eyes wide and fearful as I stared at the laptop screen. The perspective of the shot was chilling. It was taken from inside my room. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to escape from the sinister cage my hotel room had become. But then a thought struck me. If the photos were being taken from inside my room, there had to be clues. I decided to use my journalistic skills to uncover the truth. I began a meticulous examination of my room. I looked for hidden cameras, unusual items, anything that could be out of place. The meticulous scrutiny went on for days, and just when my hope was ebbing away, I noticed a tiny glint from the smoke detector in the ceiling. Taking it down, my hands shaking, I found a tiny camera lens embedded within. A rush of horror, paranoia, and fury coursed through me. But now, at least, I had something concrete, evidence. With the camera in hand, I went to the hotel management and then to the police, my apprehension ebbing away, replaced by a fierce determination. They took me seriously, and within days, the net closed around the perpetrator. A worker from the hotel's maintenance team, who had installed the security system in my room, was apprehended. He'd been selling such photos on the dark web, profiting from the violation of personal lives. The sense of violation took a long time to fade, but the victory was sweet. The sight of him being led away in handcuffs was satisfying. Yet it sent a shiver down my spine to think of the horror I'd lived through, the invisible observer who turned my life into a voyeuristic gallery. The morning sun streamed through the windows of my small-town flower shop, casting a warm glow over the vibrant blooms. I've been a florist for over 40 years, and the scent of fresh flowers still brought me immense joy. The bell above the door tinkled, signaling the customer's entrance. I looked up to greet them, but the shop was empty. Puzzled, I went back to arranging a bouquet of roses. A few minutes later, the phone rang. I answered expecting a regular order, but the voice on the other end was unfamiliar, raspy, and sent a chill down my spine. "I need a bouquet," the voice whispered. "Red roses, white lilies, and black dahlias. Deliver it to 13 Elm Street." "That's an unusual combination," I remarked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Any particular message you'd like to include?" There was a pause, and then the voice said, "Make sure she knows she's next." I felt a knot in my stomach. "Excuse me?" "Just write the message," the voice insisted, and then hung up. I stood there, phone in hand, trying to process the conversation. Who was she? And what did next mean? I considered calling the police, but I had no evidence of any wrongdoing. It could be a prank, or maybe I misunderstood. I prepared the bouquet as instructed, the contrasting colors creating an eerie beauty. I penned the message on a small card, my hands trembling. The address, 13 Elm Street, was unfamiliar. It was on the outskirts of town, a place I rarely ventured. With the bouquet in hand, I decided to deliver it myself. I needed to see who lived at 13 Elm Street and perhaps understand the meaning behind the message. The drive was quiet, the streets empty. As I approached the address, I noticed the house was old and dilapidated, with overgrown weeds and broken windows. It looked abandoned. Hesitating, I approached the front door and rang the bell. No answer. I was about to leave the bouquet on the doorstep when the door creaked open. A woman, pale and gaunt, stood there, her eyes wide with fear. "Are you okay?" I asked, concerned. She glanced at the bouquet and then at the card. Reading the message, her face turned ashen. "Who sent this?" she whispered. "I don't know," I replied. "I received an anonymous order." She looked around nervously. "You need to leave. Now." Confused and scared, I hurried back to my car. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw a tall, shadowy figure watching me from the doorway of the house. I reached my shop, my heart pounding. I locked the doors and called the police. They arrived quickly and took my statement. They also went to check on the woman at 13 Elm Street. Hours later, an officer returned to update me. The woman was safe, but she had a chilling story to tell. She had been in witness protection after testifying against a dangerous criminal. The bouquet was a message, a warning that they had found her. The police relocated her immediately, and I was less shaken, realizing the gravity of what had transpired. The seemingly innocent bouquet had carried a deadly message, and I had been an unwitting messenger. The incident haunted me for years. I became more cautious, screening my orders and customers. The small-town charm of my flower shop was forever tainted by the memory of that eerie morning and the message in the petals. The engine stuttered, gasped, and gave out. My heart froze as the headlights flickered, then dimmed. It was late, far too late, and I was stranded on a narrow, deserted road, surrounded by a dense forest that was almost suffocating. The only sounds were the nocturnal whispers of nature and the rapid beat of my heart, echoing in my ears. I gripped the steering wheel, trying to process the next steps. I'd always been the sort to meticulously plan out my road trips, accounting for every variable. I'd never imagined I'd end up here. Pulling out my phone, I hoped to see bars of signal, but as expected, no service. I exhaled deeply. Think, I muttered to myself. I knew there was a small town about 20 miles back. Going forward was uncertain, and it would be folly to venture deeper into unknown territory. The logical step was to head back. Turning on the hazard lights, I stepped out, the sharp cold air stinging my face. Every tiny noise seemed amplified, every rustle a potential threat. I started walking briskly, occasionally glancing behind. I wasn't sure if it was my paranoia or something real, but I felt like I was being watched. About 2 miles in, headlights approached. The relief was immense. Finally, I thought, someone can give me a lift. But as the car neared, it slowed down, almost crawling past me. Inside, I could make out a dark silhouette. The car didn't stop, but there was something profoundly unsettling about that slow drive-by. The back of my neck tingled as I watched the car's red taillights grow smaller in the distance. 10 minutes later, the same car came back from the direction I was heading. It slowed down, crawling again as it passed me. Panic set in. Why was this car patrolling this desolate road? My instincts screamed at me. I dove into the trees, trying to keep my breath quiet. The car stopped right where I'd been standing. The door creaked open. Silence. Moments felt like hours. Then I heard footsteps shuffling through the gravel. He's gone. A deep voice rumbled. Another voice, raspy and cold, responded. We'll find him. My mind raced, calculating odds, outcomes, risks. Should I make a run for it? Should I wait? But then a light shone through the trees. A flashlight. They were searching for me. Determined to avoid detection, I began moving deeper into the woods. I tried to move silently, avoiding twigs, but every rustle and snap seemed deafening. After what felt like hours, the faint sound of a distant highway reached my ears. Elated, I picked up my pace, desperate to reach safety. Suddenly, the ground gave way beneath me. I tumbled down a sharp incline, my world a blur of pain and fear. When I finally came to a stop, I was at the bottom of a ditch. My leg throbbed, and I realized with a sinking feeling that I had twisted my ankle. Forcing myself to stand, I limped towards the highway sounds. Just as the road came into view, headlights illuminated the area. The same car. My heart sank. I prepared for the worst. As the car neared, the window rolled down, but to my shock, it wasn't the strangers from before. A familiar face looked out. Dave? My voice was barely a whisper. John? What the hell are you doing out here? Dave was an old college buddy. I quickly relayed my ordeal. He looked horrified. We need to get out of here, he said urgently. This road is known for unexplained disappearances. We drove in silence, the weight of my near miss sinking in. When we reached the nearest town, Dave told me more. Locals avoided that road, talking of gangs that preyed on stranded motorists. I was just grateful to have made it out, thanks to a chance encounter with an old friend. I'd never look at a deserted road the same way again. The thrill of adventure was replaced by a cold realization. Sometimes terror lurks in the most unexpected places. The hum of the sewing machine was the only sound in my downtown tailor shop that afternoon. The sun streamed through the dusty windows, casting a warm glow on the wooden floor. I, an elderly tailor with more than 50 years of experience, was engrossed in mending a jacket. It was an old, worn-out piece, but the fabric was of high quality. It had seen better days, and I wondered about the stories it could tell. As I worked on the jacket, my fingers brushed against something crinkled inside one of the pockets. Curious, I reached in and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a note written in a hurried scrawl. They know. Meet me at the old bridge by midnight. Bring the money or they'll find out about us. Don't trust anyone. A shiver ran down my spine. I looked around. half expecting someone to be watching me, but the shop was empty. The weight of the note bore down on me, and I felt a sudden rush of paranoia. Who had written this? And to whom? Was it the owner of the jacket? And what was this crime they were talking about? I tried to shake off the feeling and went back to my work, but the note's words echoed in my mind. The afternoon sun began to wane, casting long shadows on the floor. Every creak of the wooden panels, every rustle of fabric made me jump. I felt like I was being watched, like I had unwittingly become a part of some dark secret. A bell jingled, signaling a customer's entrance. I looked up to see a tall, gaunt man with piercing eyes staring at me. He wore a hat that cast a shadow over his face, but I could see the sharp contours of his cheekbones and the tension in his jaw. "Is my jacket ready?" he asked in a deep, gravelly voice. I hesitated for a moment, then handed him the mended jacket, deliberately avoiding his gaze. He put it on and reached into the pocket, his eyes widening slightly when he realized the note was missing. "Where is it?" he demanded. I feigned ignorance. "Where's what?" He took a step closer, his eyes boring into mine. "The note, where is it?" I swallowed hard, my heart racing. "I don't know what you're talking about." He looked around the shop, his gaze settling on the trash bin where I had thrown the note. He retrieved it and read it, his expression darkening. "You've read it?" he stated, more than asked. I nodded, unable to speak. The atmosphere in the shop grew thick with tension. The man's presence was suffocating, and I felt trapped. He leaned in, his face inches from mine. "You shouldn't have," he whispered menacingly. Suddenly, the bell jingled again. A police officer walked in, his hand resting on his holster. "Is everything okay here?" he asked, eyeing the stranger. The man straightened up, his demeanor changing instantly. "Just collecting my jacket," he replied smoothly, flashing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The officer nodded but didn't leave. The stranger paid for the mending and left, but not before giving me one last chilling look. The officer approached me. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded, still in shock. "Who was that?" I whispered. The officer sighed. "I don't know. I saw a suspicious car and came in to check if everything is okay with you." I shuddered, realizing how close I had come to danger. The note, the stranger, the crime, it all felt surreal. The officer patted my shoulder. "Stay safe," he said, leaving the shop. As the sun set, casting the shop in darkness, I locked up and headed home, the weight of the day's events heavy on my shoulders. The city's secrets, once hidden in the folds of a jacket, had been laid bare, and I had been a witness to its dark underbelly. The next day, I read in the newspaper about the incident under the bridge. The tall, gaunt man's picture was on the front page. He had been found dead near the old bridge, the very place mentioned in the note. The city's secrets had claimed another victim, and I couldn't help but feel a chill run down my spine, grateful for my narrow escape. It's always the whir of engines that kicks my paranoia into gear. The turbine's hum lulls most into a false sense of security, a domesticated dragon of steel and fuel under the command of capable pilots. But to me, it sounds like a grotesque lullaby, sung by the mechanical Grim Reaper. My name's Lila, a 30-something solo traveler. Traveling is my job, my passion, and my curse. Today, I was on flight 113 from New York to London, a routine trip I had made countless times. I am a woman, yes, but fear is a stranger to me, and yet, today, I felt a frisson of unease crawl up my spine as I stepped onto the plane, a premonition of catastrophe. The journey began without issue. We reached cruising altitude, the seatbelt sign blinked off, and the cacophony of relaxed chatter echoed within the aluminum tube soaring above the Atlantic. Yet my heart drummed its own uneasy rhythm, matching the thrum of the engines outside. An hour into the flight, a series of loud thumps and vibrations jolted the plane. The cabin lights flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced in the corners of my eyes. The friendly hum of the engines transformed into a wail of distress. Panic gripped the cabin, a silent tidal wave of terror that swept from front to back, leaving white-faced, wide-eyed passengers in its wake. My pulse quickened. As a frequent flyer, I recognized the signs. Turbulence, possibly severe. I pulled the seatbelt tighter, my knuckles pale and trembling. The flight attendants, masking their own fear with a veneer of professionalism, advised everyone to remain seated and buckled. A tense silence ensued, the hum of the engines now a monstrous roar in our ears. The plane started losing altitude rapidly. The stomach-churning drop felt like an elevator with cut cables. The calm, controlled voice of the pilot came over the loudspeaker, promising we were experiencing technical difficulties and that they were doing everything they could. The flight continued on, the minutes stretching into agonizing hours. Fear curdled into a horrifying realization that we might not survive. My mind darted to the cold, merciless Atlantic Ocean beneath us, but a kernel of hope was still kindled in my heart, refusing to be extinguished. Suddenly, a man in the adjacent row, a mechanic by trade, raised his voice, breaking the silent tension. He had overheard the crew's radio chatter. He explained the situation with a calm, practiced air. Both engines had malfunctioned, but the pilots were trying to execute a rare but doable procedure, a glide approach, relying on the plane's aerodynamics and minimal engine power to keep us in the air. His calmness was infectious. Even as we experienced frequent drops and unnerving shakes, we clung to his words. Over the intercom, the pilot confirmed our worst fears and greatest hope: an attempted water landing. Fear was a bitter taste in our mouths, but it was balanced by the strange sense of relief that someone was fighting for our survival. The descent was terrifying. The plane rattled and screamed against the forces of nature. The flight attendants guided us through the emergency procedures, their voices shaky but strong. Everyone was silent, preparing for the impact. The crash was shockingly smooth. The plane kissed the surface of the water, the belly of the beast skidding along the waves. The cabin jolted, luggage tumbled, and screams echoed. Then, as quickly as it began, it was over. The plane bobbed gently on the open sea, an improbable lifeboat. Rescue was swift. A commercial ship not far from our location reached us in under an hour. As we huddled on the ship's deck, watching the dying day paint the sky with hues of blood and fire, I realized the absurdity of our survival. The uncanny odds, the impeccable execution of an almost impossible maneuver, the proximity of a rescue ship. The emotional roller coaster left me spent. Fear, horror, and paranoia had coursed through my veins, only to be replaced by relief and shock at our unlikely survival. I looked at the silhouette of our half-submerged airplane in the dying light, a symbol of our harrowing ordeal and a testament to human resilience. From then on, the whir of engines sings a different lullaby to me. It's a reminder that life is fragile, precarious, and unpredictable, but also remarkably tenacious, resilient, and full of miracles. The first hint of turbulence started when I was dozing off. The gentle rocking of the aircraft had lulled me into a state of relaxation, despite the thick sense of dread I had felt earlier. The flight had been smooth over the vast oceans, but as we approached the rugged mountain range, I knew things would change. I've always hated flying. Call it a phobia or just plain irrational fear. For as long as I can remember, I've been terrified of the idea of being 30,000 feet in the air. But being a businessman, I often didn't have the luxury of choosing an alternative. This flight was no exception. A last-minute meeting, a client I couldn't say no to, and a presentation that couldn't wait had landed me in seat 21A. A sudden jolt brought me back to reality. The plane lurched violently, causing the overhead bins to rattle. As I clutched my armrest, trying to steady myself, the soothing voice of the captain echoed through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are currently experiencing some turbulence due to our flight over a mountainous region. Please remain seated and ensure your seatbelts are fastened." The cabin lights dimmed, adding to the eeriness. I looked out of the window, searching for some semblance of the ground. Instead, a dense layer of fog surrounded us, blocking any view of the landscape below. It was like we were floating in a realm of obscurity, disconnected from the world. The man sitting beside me seemed calm. Dressed in a charcoal suit, he looked around the age of 50, with peppered hair and a calculating gaze. He noticed my distress and leaned over. "First time over the mountains?" I nodded, gulping down my anxiety. It's not the mountains. I've always been terrified of flying." He smiled, but it wasn't comforting. Instead, there was a cold, distant look in his eyes that sent a chill down my spine. "You know," he began in a whisper, "sometimes it's not the flight you should be afraid of. It's the people on it." Before I could respond, the plane shook violently again. Overhead, the seatbelt sign flashed, and the flight attendants hurriedly strapped themselves in. Every cell in my body was screaming, telling me that something was gravely wrong. In the midst of the chaos, the man beside me reached into his pocket and pulled out a small black device. It was square with a blinking red light. My heart raced faster, realizing the implication of what I was seeing. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he whispered, holding it up to the dim cabin light. "One push of a button, and all our worries end." I was frozen in fear, my voice trapped in my throat. Was this a hijacking? Was this the end? Sensing my panic, he leaned closer. "What's more terrifying? The unpredictability of this flight, or the knowledge that one person has the power to end it all?" I took a deep breath, summoning every ounce of courage. "What do you want?" I stammered. He smirked, pressing the device into my hand. "Your choice." The weight of responsibility was overwhelming. My mind raced, evaluating every possible outcome. The plane continued to shudder, and the reality of the situation settled in. I was being tested. "Time's ticking," he whispered. Summoning my strength, I stood up, holding the device high for everyone to see. "There's a man here with a bomb," I yelled. Within seconds, 2 air marshals tackled the man, restraining him and confiscating the device. As they dragged him away, his eerie laughter echoed through the cabin, sending shivers down my spine. The plane soon stabilized, and the captain's voice came on again, this time with an added relief. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've passed through the turbulent area and are approaching our destination. Thank you for your cooperation." The rest of the flight was a blur. Upon landing, I was met by a swarm of security personnel and investigators, all wanting to know about the man and the device. To everyone's shock, the device turned out to be a harmless decoy. The man, as I later learned, was a disgruntled ex-employee of the airline, aiming to spread fear rather than actual harm. Ever since my son was born, I've been a bus driver. For as long as I can remember, it's been me, old Bessie, the faded yellow school bus, and the winding dirt roads of Holloway County. As I lived alone, I took the late shifts, the emptiness of the roads, the soft hum of Bessie's engine, the flickering street lamps casting eerie shadows. It all lent an unusual charm to my mundane life. One summer afternoon, the sky looked like a pot of melted silver, a canvas smeared with charcoals of the impending storm. I had just finished my usual stops when I saw him. A man standing at an unofficial stop, where nobody ever boarded. He was tall and gaunt, a hat low over his eyes, a long coat concealing his body. As he climbed on, I felt a shiver crawl up my spine, a primal instinct of unease. But I shrugged it off, a mere figment of my overworked imagination. He sat at the back, in the shadows, silent. Hours passed, stop after stop, but he never got off. His silence was unsettling, and every time I looked into the rear-view mirror, I found his hat-covered face staring back, an unreadable expression in the shadows. The storm arrived, transforming the rural route into a torrential nightmare, rain lashing on Bessie's roof, lightning illuminating the surroundings in a stark, monochromatic horror movie. The man continued to sit, his face a cipher in the rear-view mirror. A sudden fear gripped me. The lonely roads, the relentless storm, the ceaseless silence, the unknown man. It all suddenly felt like a chilling nightmare I couldn't wake from. Overwhelmed, I pulled over, the rain thrashing outside, the man's gaze piercing the silence. "Sir, this is the end of the line," I stuttered. No response. The persistent passenger just sat there. "Sir?" I said, louder, fear creeping into my voice. No answer. Gathering all my courage, I started towards him, every step echoing through the eerily silent bus. As I neared, I felt a cold gust of wind, as though death itself had swept through Bessie's doors. His head was low, hat still obscuring his features. Gently, I touched his shoulder. He jerked up, removing his hat, and my heart almost jumped out of my chest. It was me, an older version, with hollow eyes and pale skin, gaunter than the reflection I saw every day. "Turn around," he whispered, his voice a hoarse echo of mine. Incredulous, I turned to look out the front window. There, washed in the ruthless storm, lay a massive tree, uprooted, sprawled across the road, right where Bessie would have been, had I not stopped. Still reeling, I turned back, but the seat was empty. The man had vanished, leaving behind an eerie silence, a bone-chilling fear, and a reality that was too terrifying to comprehend. The rain poured heavily outside, the rhythmic patter providing a strange sense of solace. I found myself at Lat's in Literature, my favorite coffee shop, clutching a steaming mug of cappuccino between my hands. The old mahogany bookshelves around the room, filled with vintage titles, always reminded me of the library I worked in. The ambience, the scent of old books, and the hum of whispered conversations made me feel safe. I had agreed to meet Kevin, my childhood friend, after years of no contact. We drifted apart after college, life taking us in different directions. A message out of the blue from him had caught me off guard. He said he needed to talk, that he had something to confess. My curious nature, coupled with my trusting disposition, urged me to accept his invitation. He looked different, not just older, but wearier. His once bright blue eyes now looked haunted, constantly darting around, never meeting mine. His fingers kept tapping nervously on the table. "Lucia," he began, swallowing hard, "there's something I need to tell you, something I did." My heart raced. Was he in trouble? Did he need money? I hoped I could help, despite the growing sense of unease. "It's about Amelia." His voice cracked. Amelia was a common friend from our college days, someone I hadn't thought about in years. A rush of memories came flooding back, the three of us laughing, studying, and celebrating together. But the last time I saw Amelia was the night of our graduation party. She left early, and no one had seen or heard from her since. "What about Amelia, Kevin?" I whispered, my voice trembling. He gulped down his coffee as if trying to wash away the guilt. I was the last one to see her that night. I blinked, waiting for him to continue. "We had an argument near the old boathouse. I was angry, drunk, and things got out of hand. Before I knew it, she was lying motionless on the ground. I felt the blood drain from my face. The cozy coffee shop seemed to close in around me, the whispers of other patrons growing louder, distorted. She was gone, Lucia, and I panicked. I hit her. Every logical fiber in my being screamed to get away from Kevin, to run and inform the police. But my trusting nature, the history we shared, held me in place. "Have you told anyone else?" I asked, my voice barely audible. His gaze fixed on me. "No, only you. I thought you'd understand." Understand? Understand that he'd taken a life and kept it a secret for over a decade. My mind raced. What was my next step? Before I could think further, Kevin's cold hand clamped over mine. "You won't tell anyone, will you? Please, Lucia." I nodded slowly, struggling to mask my horror, trying to buy time. "I need to process this, Kevin." He seemed to relax a bit, releasing my hand. "Thank you. I knew I could trust you." Our meeting was a blur after that. I made some excuse about needing to leave early and practically fled from the coffee shop. I struggled with my conscience that night. Sleep was elusive. The weight of the confession bore down on me and paranoia took hold. Would he come after me if he thought I'd tell? Would I become his next victim? The next morning, I went to the police station and recounted our conversation. Within hours, they'd arrested Kevin. Amelia's remains were found shortly after, near the old boathouse. The trial was quick, the evidence against Kevin damning. As he was led away, his once vibrant blue eyes met mine. They were full of betrayal. But it wasn't me who betrayed him, it was his own guilt. In the aftermath, I struggled with trust. My innate tendency to believe in the good of people was shattered. However, time heals. Slowly, with therapy and the support of loved ones, I began to rebuild my life, my beliefs. Yet, every time I pass Latin literature, a shiver runs down my spine, reminding me of that rainy day when my world changed forever. The mountains had always called out to me. Their picturesque beauty and the solitude they provided was what my soul craved. After months of planning, the weekend was finally here. Me and three of my closest friends, Linda, Jake, and Hannah, had decided to go on a hiking trip. Our journey started on a bright and clear morning. The air was crisp with a hint of pine. The only sound, apart from our chatter, was the crunch of leaves and twigs beneath our boots. By noon, we had reached our camping spot, a beautiful clearing surrounded by tall trees, overlooking a calm blue lake. As the day progressed, Jake began setting up the tents while Linda and I gathered firewood. Hannah decided to take a swim, but even in the midst of this idyllic setting, something felt off. I caught a whiff of a strong, unfamiliar scent. I turned around to see a man standing at the edge of our campsite, watching us intently. "Can we help you?" I called out, trying to mask the unease in my voice. He didn't say anything at first, just stared, and then in a low, gravelly voice, he said, "You shouldn't be here." With that, he disappeared into the woods. By evening, we were all seated around the campfire, trying to shrug off the unease. The unknown man's words played on repeat in my mind, but I kept telling myself he was just a local not used to visitors. However, as darkness blanketed the forest, the stillness was broken by another scent, the unmistakable smell of smoke. At first, it was faint, but it grew stronger, signaling a wildfire was approaching. Panicking, Jake suggested we pack up and leave, but the smoke was thickening quickly, reducing visibility. As we fumbled in the dark, I felt a firm grip on my arm. It was the man from earlier. His eyes looked wild, and in the dim light, I could see a blood-stained knife in his hand. "You shouldn't have come," he whispered menacingly, pushing me towards the fire. I screamed, alerting the others. In the chaos, the scent of smoke grew stronger, and the glow from the approaching wildfire was now evident. Jake tackled the man, struggling to disarm him, while Linda and Hannah tried to gather our belongings. My heart raced. Between the man's crazed demeanor and the approaching wildfire, our lives hung in the balance. As we made our escape, the man's chilling laughter echoed behind us. "You can run, but the flames will get you." Navigating through the thick smoke, we scrambled down the mountain. Our eyes stung and our lungs burned. But the fear of the man and the wildfire propelled us forward. Suddenly, Linda tripped. As I bent down to help her up, I caught sight of the man, his silhouette illuminated by the flames. He was right behind us. With adrenaline pumping through our veins, we reached a small creek. The water was our only hope to fend off the fire and the man. We jumped in, immersing ourselves, hoping the smoke and water would mask our scent. The sound of crackling flames grew closer, but the man's footsteps faded. Hours passed, and as dawn broke, the fire had been contained, and the man was nowhere to be seen. Drenched and exhausted, we were finally found by rescuers. The forest was devastated, but we were alive. Later, we learned the horrifying truth. The man had been a notorious serial killer, responsible for several deaths in the area. He had set the wildfire to trap and kill us. The forest had been his hunting ground for years. The sun was high in the sky, casting a harsh light over the local garage where I worked. The midday heat was stifling, and the scent of oil and gasoline filled the air. I wiped the sweat from my brow, taking a moment to appreciate the quiet. It was rare for the garage to be this silent at this hour. A car pulled up, an old, battered sedan with a faded paint job. It looked like it had seen better days. The driver's side door opened, and a tall man in a black suit stepped out. He looked out of place, too polished for this dusty town. His eyes, hidden behind dark sunglasses, scanned the surroundings before settling on me. "Are you the mechanic?" he asked, his voice smooth but carrying an underlying tension. I nodded, "That's me. What can I do for you?" He handed me the car keys, and I noticed a folded piece of paper tucked into the keyring. "Just a tune-up," he said. "But whatever you do, don't look in the trunk." I raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Why not?" He hesitated for a moment, then said, "Just a personal request. Can you respect that?" I shrugged. "Sure, it's your car. I'll have it ready by evening." He nodded. "I'll be back then," and walked away without another word. Curiosity gnawed at me. What was in that trunk? I unfolded the note attached to the keys. It read, "Do not open the trunk. For your own safety." The warning only fueled my curiosity, but I had work to do. I began the tune-up, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the trunk. The car itself was ordinary, but the weight of the secret it held was palpable. Hours passed, and I was almost done. The sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the garage. The silence was broken only by the occasional clang of tools. I was alone, the other mechanics having left for the day. I couldn't resist any longer. I approached the trunk, my heart racing. The note's warning echoed in my mind, but I had to know. I inserted the key and turned it. The trunk clicked open. I lifted the lid slowly, the suspense almost unbearable. Inside, I found a large metal box with a combination lock. Beside it was another note. "You shouldn't have looked. Leave now and forget what you've seen." Panic surged through me. What had I gotten myself into? I closed the trunk, my hands shaking. I decided to finish the tune-up and get the car out of the garage as soon as possible. Just as I was about to lock up, the man in the black suit returned. He looked at me, his expression unreadable behind those sunglasses. "Is it done?" he asked. I nodded, handing him the keys. "All set." He paused, then asked, "Did you look in the trunk?" I hesitated, then lied, "No." He seemed to accept my answer, but as he got into the car, he said, "Remember, some things are better left unknown." He drove away, leaving me in the gathering darkness, my heart still racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something terrible. The weight of the secret I now carried was heavy, and I knew I would never forget that day. The next morning, the local news reported a series of mysterious disappearances in the area. The only clue left behind at each scene was a note, "You shouldn't have looked." When the power first cut out, I thought it was just another citywide blackout. It wasn't unusual for the ancient electrical infrastructure in this city to falter every now and then. A pang of annoyance echoed within me, but quickly subsided. This was part of living alone in my first apartment. Independence came with its fair share of inconveniences. However, the ordinary quickly morphed into the extraordinary when I looked out my apartment window. I expected to see a city plunged into darkness, but instead, I was met with the normal nighttime cityscape. Office towers, skyscrapers, and neighboring apartments blazed with light. It seemed that my building was the only one cloaked in darkness. I felt a chill run down my spine, and my stomach twisted with unease. The darkness around me seemed oppressive, as if it was slowly pushing me towards a corner. I reached for my phone, hoping for the comforting glow of the screen to slice through the darkness, but my hand clutched at emptiness. I'd left it charging in the other room. I muttered a curse and fumbled my way through the dark. The fear was irrational, I knew. I was alone in my apartment. The door was bolted shut. I was safe. And yet, the cold tendrils of paranoia were beginning to curl around my heart. I tried to laugh it off, to berate myself for being so childish. But the silence of my apartment only seemed to amplify the terror clawing at my mind. As I groped through the darkness, my foot brushed against something on the floor, something that shouldn't be there. It was soft. It moved. A gasp caught in my throat as I fell backward, my mind conjuring horrifying images of what could be lying on my apartment floor. Who was there? My voice shook, barely a whisper in the quiet darkness. My heart pounded against my chest like a wild animal attempting to escape its cage. There was no reply. In the dark, time seemed to stretch. Each second bloated into minutes, into hours. Fear, raw and all-consuming, threatened to choke me. Suddenly, I heard a low, growling noise. It was guttural, primal, and much too close. Every hair on my body stood on end. Driven by sheer terror, I leaped to my feet and ran towards my bedroom. The darkness swallowed me whole. I crashed into furniture, fumbling blindly towards the perceived safety of my bedroom. I reached the room and slammed the door shut, panting hard. I was trembling uncontrollably, my mind filled with nightmarish visions of what could be in my apartment. Then it struck me. My phone. I'd left it charging on my bedside table. I scrambled towards the faint, pulsating glow of the charging indicator, almost sobbing in relief as I held the phone in my hand. Just as I was about to dial 911, the bedroom door creaked open. My blood turned to ice. The growling noise was back, louder this time. I didn't consider my options. I flung open my window, slipped onto the fire escape, and began to descend as quickly and quietly as I could. The darkness seemed less oppressive outside, the city lights offering some semblance of safety. But the sound from my apartment didn't stop. It filled the night air, turning it thick and heavy with fear. I reached the ground just as the power in my building flickered back on. Looking up, I could see the silhouette of something massive moving in my apartment. Something that definitely wasn't human. The police arrived soon after, alerted by my frantic call. They found my apartment ransacked, the remains of a large animal, maybe a bear, that had somehow managed to get in through the fire escape. The relief that washed over me was indescribable. The city's morning bustle was a predictable rhythm to Robert, one that he had danced to for as long as he could remember. On this day, the sun streamed in through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Chit Cafe adjoining the bank, casting golden ribbons across the polished wooden floor. Robert's spot, as always, was in the back corner, away from the claimer, granting him a panoramic view of the cafe. Lifting the cup to his lips, Robert relished the scent of freshly ground coffee beans that promised another day of sharp focus. As he paused, emotion caught his attention. He looked up, and for a fleeting moment, his world went still. Across the room was a man whose face seemed to mirror his, almost perfectly. Robert squinted, setting his cup down with a soft clang. The man had the same deep-set blue eyes, the same thin lips, and the same scar below the right eyebrow, a remnant from Robert's childhood folly. But it wasn't just the physical resemblance that took Robert's breath away. The man seemed to echo Robert's very essence, right down to the way he scanned the morning paper and hesitated momentarily before every sip of coffee. His heart raced, and thoughts swirled. Was this some kind of twisted joke? Had he, in his 40 years, somehow managed to forget an identical twin? Or maybe, in the vast maze of human genetics, had nature simply recycled his features in another soul? He was so engrossed in his thoughts that he hardly noticed his phone vibrating furiously against the wooden table. It was a call from the bank's headquarters, the caller ID flashing his manager's name. "Robert," the voice boomed as soon as he answered. "We have a situation. An account discrepancy. Need you back immediately." Robert glanced back at the man, who was now deeply engrossed in his paper. With a deep breath, he decided to confront the stranger after addressing the urgency at work. "I'll be right there," he replied, hurriedly paying for his coffee. But fate had other plans. When Robert cast one last, lingering look toward the corner table, the man was gone, leaving behind an empty cup and an aura of profound mystery. The city's rhythm, which had been so familiar just moments before, now felt unsettling and strange. The echoing hallways of the bank were synonymous with Robert's understanding of his world. Each step he took on the pristine marble floors was accompanied by the rhythmic tick-tock of the grand clock by the entrance. Today, however, as he hurried back to his office, the surroundings seemed surreal, as if he was walking through a dream. Once the account discrepancy was sorted out, a relatively minor error that took more time than it should have, Robert's thoughts immediately returned to the mysterious man at the cafe. He found himself scanning faces in the bank, half expecting to see that hauntingly familiar reflection staring back at him. His day took a turn for the bizarre when Sarah, a junior associate, stopped him in the hallway. "Thanks for the advice on that stock, Robert. My parents are thrilled with the returns. I didn't know you attended those small investment parties." Robert blinked, perplexed. "I didn't give any advice, Sarah, and I haven't been to any parties recently." She chuckled lightly. Must have been another late night for you. Don't work too hard," and went on her way. The feeling of unease deepened as the day wore on. At lunch, his friend and colleague, Mike, mentioned the night out they had supposedly shared the previous weekend. "Man, those jokes you cracked were something else," Mike laughed. Robert, feeling the weight of confusion pressing down, managed a weak smile. "Must have been quite a night. I can hardly remember." He was lying, of course. His weekend had been uneventful, spent mostly reading. But the incident that truly shook him to his core came later in the evening. As he was leaving the bank, Mrs. Peters, a close family friend and confidant of his late mother, approached him. "Robert, dear," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I wanted to thank you for our talk at your father's grave last week. It felt good to share those memories and emotions. I hadn't realized how much guilt you held about not being there when he passed." A cold shiver ran down Robert's spine. He had not visited his father's grave in months, haunted by memories and regrets. He stared at Mrs. Peters, mouth agape, words failing him. Seeing his shocked expression, she reached out, touching his arm gently. "It's okay, dear. It was therapeutic for both of us. Take care." She walked away, leaving Robert in a whirlwind of disbelief. He tried to convince himself that maybe these were innocent mistakes, simple cases of confusion. But the pit in his stomach grew heavier, and by the time he returned home, Robert was filled with an ineffable dread. Were these just coincidences? Or was the man from the cafe, his doppelganger, living moments of his life for him? The bank was more than just a workplace for Robert. It was a sanctuary, a place where everything made sense. Numbers were predictable, they followed patterns, and patterns were comforting. However, recent events were fracturing his solace. A few days had passed since the strange encounters, but they weighed heavily on Robert's mind. In his office, he found himself staring blankly at spreadsheets, the numbers blurring into a fog of confusion. As lunchtime approached, he took a moment to glance out the window, hoping for a momentary escape from his spiraling thoughts. The busy streets below showcased the city in its vibrant daily rhythm. Amidst the crowd, a familiar face caught his attention. It was him, or rather, the man who looked just like him. He was outside the bank, standing in a tight embrace with Clara, Robert's distant cousin who occasionally visited the bank for her business transactions. The sight was paralyzing. Here was his mirror image, sharing an intimate moment with a member of his family. Overwhelmed by a mixture of dread, intrigue, and a need for clarity, Robert hurriedly left his office. He followed from a distance, trying to remain inconspicuous. The doppelganger, along with Clara, walked through the city's labyrinthine streets. Their conversation seemed lighthearted, punctuated by occasional laughter. Robert's thoughts raced. Was this man a long-lost twin? An imposter? What did he want with Clara? The uncertainty was gnawing at him. His pursuit led him to an older part of the city. The familiar hum of modern life gave way to the muted sounds of the past. Cobblestone streets echoed with memories, and aged brick buildings whispered stories of days gone by. The pair finally stopped in front of a grand but worn-out apartment complex. As Clara bid the man goodbye with a warm hug, Robert hid behind a nearby kiosk, waiting for her to leave. He took a deep breath, deciding to confront the man once and for all. Before Robert could gather his courage, the doppelganger entered the building. Without a second thought, Robert followed, his heart pounding loudly against the eerie silence of the building's corridor. The creaky staircase led him to the third floor, where he heard the faint echo of a key turning in a lock. The door opened to apartment 312. Waiting for a moment to ensure he wasn't noticed, Robert cautiously approached the door, which was ajar. He could hear the soft hum of a song from inside, one he recognized from his childhood. The melody was bittersweet, reminiscent of lullabies sung by his father. Gathering every ounce of courage, Robert pushed the door open further. The dimly lit apartment was a haunting portrayal of memories, with photographs that seemed eerily familiar yet distant. The man, now aware of Robert's presence, turned around. Their eyes locked. It was like staring into a reflective pool, only the water was murky, filled with secrets and pain. The silence was suffocating, both men held in the thrall of an unspoken connection. The apartment was a shrine of half-familiar memories. There were photographs, some of Robert's family and some of people he didn't recognize but bore striking resemblances. It was as if two worlds had collided, and in the chaos, truths had been scattered. Finally, the doppelganger broke the silence, his voice surprisingly soft. "You must be full of questions. Have a seat, Robert." Robert, hesitating only for a moment, took the offered chair, his eyes never leaving the other man. "Who are you?" was all he managed to whisper. "I'm Daniel," he replied, his gaze heavy with a mixture of pain and longing. "I'm your half-brother." The words hung in the air like a thick fog, obscuring everything Robert thought he knew. He tried to process the revelation, but his thoughts were a cacophony of confusion. Daniel continued, "Our father had another life, Robert, a life before you. He was married to my mother first, but when things fell apart, he abandoned us. I was just a child, and he left, never to return. He started anew, with your mother with you." Robert's mind raced back to his childhood memories, trying to find clues, hints of a past his father never mentioned. He recalled times when his father would look distant, lost in thoughts that he never shared. "I never hated you." Daniel's voice brought him back to the present. "In fact, I envied you. While you grew up in his warmth, I was left in the cold shadows of his absence. I watched from afar, always wishing to know the fatherly love you took for granted." Robert's heart ached. The weight of Daniel's words was palpable, an agony of years of unfulfilled yearnings. "But why now?" Robert inquired, his voice shaky. "Why impersonate me? Why enter my life?" Daniel hesitated, eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I wanted to feel a part of something, to experience even a fragment of the life I was denied. By becoming you, even if only for brief moments, I felt closer to our father, closer to understanding what it was like to be loved." The room was thick with emotions, years of suppressed pain surfacing. Robert was overwhelmed by guilt for a life he hadn't chosen, and Daniel was consumed by the sorrow of a love he had never known. For what felt like hours, the brothers sat in Daniel's dimly lit apartment, sharing stories, regrets, and revelations. The atmosphere was a delicate blend of bitterness and understanding. Two lives that had run parallel, now intersected in the most profound way. As the conversation flowed, Robert learned more about the hardships Daniel had faced. Without the support of their father, Daniel's mother struggled financially and emotionally. The absence of a father figure took a toll on him, pushing him to extremes in a bid to fill the void. The tales of hardship and longing painted a picture that Robert had never imagined, making him question his own privileges. Daniel cleared his throat, hesitating before his next words. "Robert, I've been thinking for a while now, and perhaps it's an absurd thought, but maybe, just maybe, you'd entertain it." Robert nodded, encouraging him to continue. "I want to buy your life, or at least rent it for a while." Robert looked at him, startled, trying to decipher if it was a cruel jest. But Daniel's eyes held a raw desperation that was hard to ignore. Seeing Robert's confusion, Daniel elaborated, "I don't mean it in a sinister way. I want to step into your life, experience the warmth of relationships I've never known, feel the joy of attending a family gathering without being the outsider, understand what it's like to walk in a world where I'm recognized and loved." Robert blinked, processing the audacity of the proposal. "And what happens to me?" Daniel hesitated for a moment before answering. "You can start fresh, somewhere new, somewhere far. With the money I've saved over the years, you can live comfortably, finding new experiences, perhaps even healing from the ones the past has inflicted upon you." Robert felt a chill run down his spine. The proposition was unsettling, yet there was a part of him, a small voice at the back of his mind, that considered it. Here was an opportunity to escape, to shed the skin of a life that was becoming increasingly suffocating. "Think about it," Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible. "A chance to redefine yourself, away from the shadows of our father's choices. And in return, you grant me a brief experience of a life I've always coveted." As the evening grew darker and the room colder, Robert wrestled with the emotions that the proposal elicited. The thought of relinquishing his identity was terrifying, but the allure of starting afresh was undeniably tempting. In the days that followed, Robert was a vessel of turmoil. His everyday world, once filled with routine and predictability, had spiraled into a realm of existential questioning. The bank's tall columns, the regular customers, even the very desk he sat behind, everything felt alien, as if he was seeing them through a distorting lens. As he walked through the corridors, he could feel the stares of colleagues, hear the whispers of meetings he hadn't attended and contributions he hadn't made. While they were discussing transactions with Robert, he knew they were really interacting with Daniel. The blur between reality and pretense was disorienting. One evening after work, Robert took a detour to the old neighborhood park where he and his father had spent countless hours. The wooden bench where they'd once shared ice creams and stories now seemed to be just an empty piece of furniture, its varnish worn out and faded. Sitting there, memories flooded back. The laughter, the advice, the silent moments they shared, all felt like they belonged to someone else's life. He remembered his father's voice, his words of wisdom, his comforting hand on a troubled brow. Those moments of genuine connection stood in stark contrast to Daniel's tales of abandonment and yearning. Tears stunned Robert's eyes as he thought of Daniel. He could no longer view his life without acknowledging the shadow of Daniel's absence. Every cherished memory with their father was now tainted with the understanding of a simultaneous neglect. He recalled Daniel's apartment, the photographs, the silent screams of longing from every frame, and the melancholy tombs that whispered tales of a forgotten son. The weight of their shared lineage, of DNA and destiny, pressed heavily on him. Late one night, Robert visited his father's grave, bathed in the soft glow of the moon. The tombstone, a silent testament to a life of secrets, stood unaffected by the son's internal chaos. He desperately wished for a sign, some guidance from the man whose choices had unknowingly shaped two destinies. "I never asked for any of this," Robert murmured, his voice shaking with emotion. "I didn't ask for a life at the expense of another. How do I make this right?" But the grave offered no answers, only the deafening silence of the night. Over the next few days, Robert observed his life with a heightened sensitivity. He noted the warm greetings from neighbors, the affectionate nuzzles from his pet dog, and the familiar embrace of family members. These seemingly mundane moments were now precious treasures, fragments of a life that someone else coveted. Torn between the comfort of his existence and the profound pain reflected in Daniel's eyes, Robert was at a crossroads. He began to question the very essence of identity and existence. What defined him? Was it the relationships he nurtured or the memories he created? The clock was ticking, and a decision loomed large. The following week, Robert stood outside Daniel's apartment, taking a moment to steel himself before knocking. The door opened to reveal Daniel, his expression a mix of hope and apprehension. Without preamble, Robert began, "I've thought long and hard about your proposal. It's audacious, unsettling, and unlike anything I've ever considered." He paused, taking a breath. "But I see the profound pain in your eyes, a pain that our father's choices inflicted upon you. If I can help mend that, even in a small way, then perhaps it's worth it." Daniel's face transformed from a look of tense anticipation to one of disbelief. You would do that for me?" Robert nodded. "But there are conditions. This can't be a permanent arrangement. We need an end date, a time when I reclaim my life, and you find a way to forge your own path." Daniel blinked away tears. "Of course, I understand. I don't want to steal your life permanently. I just want to know what it's like, to bask in its warmth, even if briefly." Over the next few hours, the two brothers sat down and drafted a meticulous agreement. They discussed every detail, from the division of financial assets to the intricacies of daily life. They set a duration of 6 months for the exchange. Robert would leave the city, adopting a new identity and a new life, while Daniel would step into his shoes, experiencing the love and familiarity Robert had always known. As they discussed the particulars, Robert emphasized the importance of maintaining the relationships he cherished. "Treat them well, Daniel. They are not just names on a paper. They are people who've shaped my life, and I trust you to respect and cherish them." Daniel nodded gravely. "I promise. This isn't just about living your life, Robert. It's about understanding, learning, and perhaps finding a way to forgive our father for the choices he made." The agreement was set. They decided on a date for the switch, allowing both enough time to prepare. As Robert left the apartment, he felt a weight lifting off his shoulders. The decision, although difficult, felt right in a way he couldn't quite explain. Over the next few days, Robert began distancing himself from his routine life. He spent time with family and friends, cherishing the moments while keeping his impending departure a secret. Every interaction was bittersweet, every goodbye left unspoken. Finally, the day arrived. Robert packed his essentials, leaving behind memories, belongings, and a life that had defined him for 40 years. As he handed the keys to Daniel, the two shared a moment of mutual understanding. "Take care of them," Robert whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "I will," Daniel replied, his gaze filled with gratitude. With one last look at his past life, Robert stepped into the unknown, while Daniel, with a mix of anxiety and excitement, prepared to step into a life he had only dreamed of. The coastal town of Larkhaven was a stark contrast to the hustle and bustle of the city Robert had left behind. Nestled between sprawling cliffs and azure waters, it was a haven of serenity and introspection. As Robert wandered its cobble streets and breathed in the salty air, he felt an odd mixture of liberation and loss. He had taken up residence in a modest cottage overlooking the sea. Every morning, he would wake up to the sound of waves crashing against the shore, a constant reminder of the vastness of life and the ebb and flow of destiny. The town's residents were warm and welcoming, but Robert chose to maintain a distance, not ready to form attachments. As days turned into weeks, the pain of separation from his former life began to fade. He kept himself busy, finding solace in painting the picturesque landscapes, reading books that had been on his list for years, and writing long letters to no one in particular, pouring out his feelings and experiences. One evening, as the sun painted the sky with hues of orange and gold, Robert sat on the porch of his cottage, pen and paper in hand. He began to pen down his journey, from the startling discovery of Daniel to the decision that had changed the course of their lives. The decision to let go of my life was not born out of weakness or escapism. It was about redemption and understanding. It was about giving someone a chance to experience love and belonging, even if momentarily. He wrote about the joys and sorrows, the love he felt for the family and friends he left behind, and the hope that Daniel was treating them with the kindness and respect they deserved. Perhaps in some twisted way, this was destiny's design. Two souls, intertwined by blood and fate, seeking solace and understanding in the choices they made. While one sought a fresh start, the other yearned for a taste of a life denied to him. As the weeks turned into months, Robert received an occasional letter from Daniel, assuring him that things were going well. The letters were a source of comfort, but also a stark reminder of the life he had temporarily relinquished. One day, a letter from Daniel arrived that was different from the rest. It spoke of a profound realization. "I've walked in your shoes, Robert, and while I've felt the warmth of the relationships you've nurtured, I've come to understand that true contentment lies in forging one's own path. Living your life has taught me that I need to find my own purpose, my own connections, rather than coveting someone else's." The letter ended with gratitude and a promise to uphold the sanctity of the agreement they had made. As the end date of their agreement neared, Robert felt a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. The thought of returning to his old life was both comforting and daunting. But he also knew that Larkhaven had given him a new perspective, a fresh lens through which to view his past, present, and future. The final day arrived. As Robert packed his belongings and prepared to head back to the city, he took one last look at the horizon. The vast expanse of the sea, with its infinite mysteries, seemed to mirror the complexities of life itself. Returning to the familiar streets of his hometown, Robert was welcomed with open arms. Friends and family remarked on the subtle changes in him, a newfound depth in his gaze, a calmness in his demeanor. Robert and Daniel met soon after, and the reunion was poignant. They spoke little, their shared experience speaking volumes. Both had grown, both had learned, and both had found a piece of themselves in the other's life. As Robert settled back into his routine, he realized that life was not about holding on to the familiar, but about embracing change and seeking understanding. His bond with Daniel grew stronger, not as mere reflections of each other, but as two distinct souls connected by shared history and mutual respect. As I stepped into the local bank, its cool, familiar ambience gave no indication that this day would be any different from the countless times I'd been here. I pulled a numbered ticket, adjusting the purse strap on my shoulder, thinking about the cup of tea I'd treat myself to afterwards. Suddenly, 3 masked individuals burst through the door, brandishing firearms and yelling commands. Panic exploded around me as screams filled the air, people falling to the ground to shield themselves. One robber approached the counter demanding cash, while the other 2 kept a watchful eye over us. My heart raced uncontrollably. I tried to keep still and invisible. The mother and child near me, the businessman, the teenager, we were all leveled by this palpable, choking fear. In the midst of it, the youngest-looking robber, jittery and clearly inexperienced, mistakenly fired his gun, embedding the bullet into the ceiling. The echo amplified our terror. From the corner of my eye, I saw one teller secretly trigger the alarm, but her slight movement was caught by the second robber. He didn't say a word, but the threat in his eyes was evident. She froze. When the robbers realized the police were outside due to the silent alarm, their panic mirrored ours. They became more erratic, shouting conflicting commands. The leader of the trio decided they needed a human shield to exit, and for reasons I'll never know, I was the unlucky choice. Cold steel pressed against my neck, the acrid smell of the gunman's sweat mixed with the undeniable scent of fear. As he dragged me toward the exit, I thought of my years in the classroom, the faces of countless students. This couldn't be my end. Outside, the glaring sun blinded me momentarily. The leader's grip on my arm tightened, and my legs nearly gave way from sheer terror. The police surrounded the bank, their megaphones urging the robbers to surrender. Every inch we moved felt like miles, every second an eternity. The robbers' hurried breathing echoed my own. I wasn't brave, wasn't planning to be a hero. I was just an old school teacher, and all I could think about was surviving. Then, out of nowhere, a car horn blared. It startled the gunman, causing him to momentarily loosen his grip. I didn't think. I didn't plan. I simply fell to the ground instinctively. In the split seconds that followed, the police acted. The robbers, distracted and outnumbered, were quickly apprehended. Later, people said I was clever to drop when I did. But in truth, it wasn't bravery or intelligence. It was raw, paralyzing fear. The trauma of that day never truly left me. The bank's familiar walls became a place of nightmares, the sun's rays a reminder of blinding terror. But amidst the fear, there was a new appreciation for the fragility of life and the unpredictability of each day. It was a quiet suburban neighborhood at night, and a cautious college student named Emily was returning home for the holidays. The winter air was chilly, and a light mist hung in the air, creating an eerie atmosphere. As she walked down the dimly lit street, she couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched. Glancing over her shoulder, she noticed a figure lurking in the shadows, just a few steps behind her. Her heart skipped a beat, and a shiver ran down her spine. Emily quickened her pace, trying to dismiss her growing unease. But no matter how fast she walked, the stranger seemed to match her every step. Panic began to set in as she realized that this was no mere coincidence. She decided to confront him, summoning every ounce of courage she had left. Turning around abruptly, she locked eyes with the stranger. His piercing gaze sent a chill down her spine. With a sinister smile, he whispered in her ear, "I've been watching you for weeks." Emily's blood ran cold as she spun around, ready to confront her stalker, but he had vanished into thin air. She looked around frantically, her heart pounding in her chest. There was no sign of him anywhere. Was she losing her mind? She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being toyed with, trapped in a twisted game. Days turned into weeks, and Emily's fear grew with each passing moment. Every creak of the floorboards and every rustle of leaves outside her window made her jump. She was on constant edge, haunted by the memory of the stranger's haunting whispers. Desperate for help, she confided in her friends and family, hoping they would believe her and offer some solace. but their dismissive responses only deepened her isolation. One night, after attending a party with her friends, Emily found herself walking home alone. The streets were deserted, and the night seemed unusually silent. As she neared her house, a shadow emerged from the darkness. It was him, the stranger who had tormented her for weeks. This time, he held a gleaming knife in his hand. A scream escaped Emily's lips as she turned and sprinted with all her might. Her heart pounded in her ears, drowning out the sound of her heavy breathing. But the stranger was relentless, his footsteps closing in on her with terrifying speed. She knew she had to find help, or else she would become another victim. Just when Emily felt her legs giving way, she saw a flickering light in the distance. Relief flooded over her as she realized it was a police car, sirens blaring, racing towards her. With renewed hope, she pushed herself harder, urging her tired muscles to keep going. The stranger's heavy breathing grew more distant as he realized the police were closing in. The police car screeched to a halt, and two officers emerged, their expressions a mix of concern and determination. Emily collapsed into their arms, gasping for breath, tears streaming down her face. She pointed in the direction the stranger had fled, desperately trying to convey the danger she had faced. The officers radioed for backup and reassured Emily that she was safe now. They quickly spread out, searching the area for any trace of the stalker. Meanwhile, they escorted Emily to the safety of their patrol car and called for an ambulance to tend to her physical and emotional wounds. In the days that followed, the police conducted a thorough investigation, dedicating themselves to bringing the stalker to justice. They enlisted the help of forensic experts, interviewed witnesses, and analyzed any evidence that could lead to his capture. Eventually, their efforts paid off. The stalker, identified as a known offender with a history of stalking and harassment, was apprehended. Emily received the news with a mix of relief and lingering trauma. Knowing that her ordeal had come to an end brought her a sense of closure, but she knew the road to recovery would be long. Emily sought professional help to overcome the deep scars left by her harrowing experience. With the support of her loved ones and therapists, she gradually regained her sense of security and rebuilt her life. She became an advocate for victims of stalking, sharing her story to raise awareness and empower others to speak out against such heinous acts. In the depths of a moonlit forest, where the canopy of ancient trees swayed with an eerie creak, I found myself venturing deeper into the heart of darkness. The dense undergrowth clawed at my clothes, leaving tattered shreds of fabric in its wake. Fear coiled around my heart like a vise, and a shiver ran down my spine as the full moon cast its pale glow upon the desolate landscape. I had come to this forsaken place for one reason alone, a reason that gnawed at the edges of my sanity with every passing day, the fear of becoming a monster. My name is Emily Sinclair, and I am a tormented loner, haunted by the whispers of the past and the shadows that danced in the recesses of my mind. I sought solace in the wilderness, hoping to find answers to the questions that plagued me. The night air was heavy with an otherworldly stillness, broken only by the distant howl of a wolf, a chilling reminder of the dangers that lurked in the darkness. As I ventured deeper into the forest, the trees closed in around me, their gnarled branches intertwining like bony fingers, creating an oppressive atmosphere. The ground beneath my feet grew moist and spongy, the stench of decay permeating the air. Strange, phosphorescent mushrooms sprouted from the decaying undergrowth, casting an ethereal glow upon the forest floor. Their sickly green light illuminated grotesque shapes, shadows that seemed to shift and writhe with a life of their own. A frisson of unease ran through me as I realized that I was now alone. Eyes, gleaming with feral hunger, glinted in the darkness. The forest was alive with unseen creatures, their presence a constant reminder of the tenuous hold I had on my own humanity. Paranoia gripped me, the feeling that I was being watched, hunted, becoming too difficult to dismiss. With each passing moment, the forest seemed to change, morphing into a twisted reflection of my fears. The trees contorted into monstrous shapes, their branches reaching out like skeletal limbs, ready to ensnare me. The ground writhed with a carpet of slithering creatures, their grotesque forms blending into the night. I stumbled, my breath coming in ragged gasps, as the forest closed in around me. And then I heard it, the low, guttural growl that sent chills coursing through my veins. It was a sound that spoke of feral instincts, of an unbridled hunger that could not be sated. I turned, my eyes widening in horror as I beheld the creature before me. A werewolf, its massive form silhouetted against the moonlit sky. Its eyes, burning with an unholy fire, locked onto mine, and a surge of primal fear coursed through my veins. The werewolf lunged, its snarling jaws dripping with saliva, and I ran. I ran as if my life depended on it, as if the very essence of my being was at stake. But the forest seemed to conspire against me, the trees closing ranks, trapping me in a nightmarish maze. I stumbled, my legs entangled in the undergrowth, and I fell to the ground. The werewolf closed in, its hot breath on my neck, its claws digging into my flesh. I closed my eyes, waiting for the inevitable, for the transformation that would turn me into a monster. But it never came. I opened my eyes to find the forest bathed in the soft light of dawn. The werewolf was gone, leaving no trace of his presence except for the scars on my body. I had survived, but the fear still lingered, the fear of what I might become. And as I limped out of that cursed forest, I knew that the battle was not over. The darkness within me still loomed, waiting to be unleashed. For in that forest, I had come face to face with the true nature of fear. The fear of becoming the very monster I had sought to escape. And now, with every full moon that graced the night sky, I would forever be haunted by the possibility that one day I might succumb to the darkness and lose myself entirely. Nestled in the heart of the Canadian wilderness, there was a remote sanctuary, isolated amidst the stoic mountain range and the unforgiving boreal forest. The desolate hotel, appropriately named the Frostbite, rose like a monolith against the harsh environment, a solitary beacon of human presence in the vast, unending expanse. It was this secluded hotel that I had selected for my retreat as I sought refuge from the clamorous world that throbbed outside my window. I am a middle-aged novelist, and the crippling noise and pace of urban life had worn me thin. A writer, I believe, thrives on silence and solitude, and the Frostbite, with its distant location and sparse clientele, seemed like the perfect haven. Each room was a cocoon, effectively soundproofed against the howling winds and the occasional murmurs of the neighboring guests. But there was one room adjacent to mine that held a sense of foreboding, room 303. It was the third day of my stay when I first noticed the man occupying room 303. He was a gaunt figure, an embodiment of profound grief, his eyes deep pools of desolation. He radiated an air of discomfort that sent ripples through my otherwise serene world, unsettling the calm surface of my solitude. In the days that followed, I noticed a chilling pattern. Late into the night, the man paced back and forth in his room, his footsteps echoing like a haunting symphony against the solid oak flooring. Sometimes, whispers of uncanny monologues escaped through the walls, punctuated by the unnerving sound of his laughter, disturbing the otherwise peaceful silence of the Frostbite. One evening, as I returned from a walk, a nauseating odor greeted me outside his door. It was a sickening amalgamation of metallic tang and decay, a scent that crawled into the nostrils and clung to the senses. The stench was so overwhelming that I found myself retching, my body rejecting the repugnant aroma with a visceral reaction. The very next day, I spotted him struggling to dispose of a large object, hastily concealed in a blood-stained sheet. His knuckles were white as they clung to the gruesome parcel, and a sheen of sweat covered his deathly pale face. Our eyes met, and a sudden chill seized me, an icy grip of terror that eclipsed all reason. That moment sparked an avalanche of dreadful thoughts. My mind was set ablaze with horrifying possibilities. The man's disturbing behavior, the repulsive smell, and the horrific parcel. The sinister puzzle pieces were falling into place, but I shrank from the picture they were forming. Resolute to confront him, I found myself standing before the door of room 303. My fist rose to knock but paused in midair. A wave of apprehension washed over me. I mustered my courage and rapped on the door. The sound echoed in the silence, unanswered. An eerie stillness hung in the air, sending shivers down my spine. My ear pressed against the cold door, straining for any sound, was met with an unsettling silence. Frantic, I sought the hotel manager. I relayed my concerns, my voice shaking as I recounted the peculiar behaviors of the man from room 303. The manager, a burly, pragmatic man, seemed skeptical but was swayed by my obvious distress. The door to room 303 creaked open under the careful hands of the manager, revealing a scene that was beyond any ghastly figment of my imagination. The room was a horrifying tableau, painted in varying shades of crimson. Centered in the room, splayed out grotesquely on the bed, lay the mutilated corpse of a wild boar. Its entrails were strewn around in a macabre display, the sight of which turned my stomach. The manager, ashen-faced, dialed the local authorities, his fingers trembling. I found myself leaning heavily against the wall, trying to reconcile the chilling scene with reality. The air was thick with the stench of death, and the silent accusation of the grotesque sight burned into my retinas. When the authorities arrived, their subsequent investigation unearthed a story that was more horrifying than the grisly scene itself. The man from room 303 was a renowned wildlife biologist suffering from severe psychosis. In his deranged state, he had hunted and killed the boar, deluded into believing that he was conducting groundbreaking scientific research. His insanity was revealed when he was found the next day, wandering aimlessly through the forest, repeating saving humanity in a crazy mantra. The hotel, the forest, the tranquility, everything was tainted with the residue of this terrifying episode. The morning was ordinary, but to Mike, everything about it held a peculiar tinge. The way his coffee rippled in the cup, the song of the morning lark from outside, even the glow of the rising sun felt unsettling, uncanny. It was as if reality was distorting, bending, preparing him for an extraordinary ordeal. He was a city man through and through, the sort who took the elevator to his fifth-floor office because stairs were too rustic. But today, he was about to embark on a journey through the dense woods of Black Pines Wilderness, utterly alien to his concrete comfort. The woods had always been there, vast and mysterious at the edge of town, but he had never ventured. It was a sudden compulsion, an uncanny urge to experience nature at its rawest. Equipped with a hiking backpack borrowed from a friend, filled with food, a map, a compass, a flashlight, and an unsettling adrenaline, Mike began his journey. As he ventured deeper into the forest, the city's clamor diminished into an eerie silence, a quiet so profound it was almost deafening. Everything here felt ancient, untamed, beautiful yet threatening. The wilderness swallowed him whole, the dense trees closing in, their twisted branches appearing like gnarled hands reaching out for him. His heart pounded, the forest whisper and rustle turning into murmurs in his mind. Every unknown sound, every movement in the peripheral of his vision sent a fresh wave of fear coursing through his veins. The second day brought an unsettling discovery. A desolate campsite, the remnant of a fire pit still warm. Around it were strewn scattered belongings, a bent canteen, a torn sleeping bag, and a bloody shirt that sent a chilling sensation down his spine. The most disturbing find, however, was a torn piece of cloth that held 4 distinct gashes that could only have been made by the claws of a large animal, most likely a bear. A sense of dread seeped into Mike's being, soaking into his thoughts, clawing at his sanity. Every sound now amplified his fear. The night brought with it 1,000 unseen horrors, each creak of the branch, every rustling leaf a portent of the beast lurking nearby. His dreams were plagued by nightmarish visions of a monstrous creature with bloodshot eyes, its growls reverberating in the chilling silence. On the third day, the forest came alive with a dreadful roar. It was close, too close. The growl echoed through the woods, a brutal declaration of the beast's presence. Mike froze. He was not alone. He knew he should turn back, leave this cursed wilderness behind, but he was hopelessly lost, his compass useless in the dense forest, the once familiar trail now a convoluted labyrinth of towering trees and undergrowth. The beast haunted him, its presence a pervasive menace. He could smell its rancid breath, see the mutilated bushes where it had passed, and hear its savage snarls. The thought of becoming his prey sent shivers down his spine, igniting an almost paralyzing fear within him. As night fell, Mike found himself cornered, the beast closing in. The brush rustled, and then he saw it, an enormous bear, its eyes burning with a terrifying hunger. Mike's heart pounded against his ribs as he remembered the flare gun in his backpack. He had only one shot, one chance to survive. With trembling hands, he fired. The forest was briefly lit in an infernal red, the monstrous bear recoiling from the sudden burst of light. But the flare, instead of scaring the beast away, seemed to enrage it further. It roared, a dreadful sound that echoed throughout the forest, and lunged at Mike. In that terrifying instant, he felt the ground give way beneath him. He was falling into darkness. He hit the ground hard, pain exploding through his body as his world faded to black. When he awoke, he was surrounded by concerned faces, flashing lights, and the sound of radios. He had fallen into a deep pit, apparently used by the local forest rangers to capture and relocate dangerous wildlife. A trap intended for the bear, his accidental fall had saved him from a gruesome fate. The bear, frightened by the commotion, had fled, leaving Mike battered but alive. The ordeal had changed Mike. No longer was he the city man who took the elevator. The wilderness had shown him his deepest fears, the untamed terror that lurked just beyond the edge of his safe, concrete world. He had looked into the eyes of death and come back, a tale that sent shivers down the spines of all who heard it, a tale of an ordinary man's terrifying encounter with the ferocious beast of the wild. The sun was barely a thin line on the horizon when John Weaver, an archaeologist of some renown, found himself standing on the edge of what he could only describe as an abyss. His team had been digging in the frozen tundra of northern Alaska for months, uncovering remnants of a long-lost civilization. But this yawning chasm was unlike anything they'd discovered before. An unending darkness seemed to stretch into its depths, swallowing the harsh Arctic sunlight without remorse. The sound that came from the depths was the first oddity, a continuous low hum, almost beyond the realm of human hearing. John felt it more than he heard it, the resonance vibrating in his bones. It was a primal, wrong sound, like the earth's marrow was groaning. Even more disturbing was the inexplicable climate around the hole. The ice and snow around it had melted into a soggy mire, giving the hole a 30-foot berth, and despite the freezing Arctic winds, standing near the edge felt like a balmy summer day. Days turned into weeks. Strange incidents started to pile up. Instruments stopped working or gave false readings. Compass needles spun erratically and satellite signals failed. The camp's huskies refused to go anywhere near the site, and their howling filled the still nights with dread. One night, a piercing scream echoed from the chasm. It was Harold, one of the crew members. They found his tent empty, his possessions scattered, and his footprints leading directly into the abyss. John organized a search, but no trace of Harold was found. No body, no blood, nothing. Harold's disappearance marked a turning point. The crew was filled with a pervasive sense of unease, as if they were intruders in a realm not meant for humans. John, however, was relentless. He couldn't let go. The mystery of the abyss was a siren's call to his curiosity. A week later, something else emerged from the depths. It wasn't a sound, but a force, a pressure. The very air seemed to thicken, becoming viscous and tangible, pulsating with an invisible rhythm. It was like the abyss was breathing. That same night, the fallen Harold returned. He stumbled into the camp, his eyes vacant, his lips muttering strange, incoherent syllables. His skin was horribly burnt, as if exposed to extreme heat. He wasn't the Harold they knew, but a hollow shell. The core, he kept repeating, like a broken record. That night, he died in his sleep, a peaceful expression on his face, as if he had found some profound relief in death. John finally decided to descend into the chasm. Rigged with climbing gear and armed with lights, he rappelled into the hole, a wireless camera broadcasting his descent to the terrified crew above. The deeper he went, the more oppressive the darkness became, and the stronger the strange hum. Hours passed. The abyss seemed to have no end. Then, abruptly, the line went slack. The crew on the surface watched in horror as the camera feed showed John looking at something in front of him, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. There, in the inky depths of the earth, illuminated by his shaky flashlight, was a gigantic, pulsating heart. It was entwined with veins and arteries that burrowed into the surrounding earth, its surface glossy and slick. With each beat, It sent waves of intense heat, the source of the strange climate. It was alive, connected to the earth, a grotesque mockery of life as they knew it. "What have we done?" John's voice was a whisper, filled with dread. As John's voice faded into the depths, the heart responded with a thunderous beat that reverberated through the chasm. The crew members on the surface clutched their ears in agony, feeling as if their very skulls were being crushed under the weight of the sound. The heart's pulsations intensified, its rhythm quickening, and the ground shook violently. Cracks spread like spider webs across the frozen landscape, swallowing tents and equipment whole. Panic gripped the remaining crew members as they scrambled to escape the crumbling campsite. Meanwhile, John found himself drawn closer to the colossal heart, unable to tear his eyes away from its mesmerizing yet horrifying presence. The heat emanating from it was oppressive, scorching his skin and searing his lungs with each breath. As he reached out a trembling hand to touch the pulsating organ, a voice echoed in his mind, a voice filled with ancient malevolence and seductive power. It whispered promises of unimaginable knowledge, untold secrets of the universe, and the chance to reshape reality itself. But there was a price, a terrible price that would forever alter his existence. Overwhelmed by the allure of the forbidden, John hesitated, his rational mind warring with an insidious curiosity. The voice grew more insistent, its tone dripping with malice, coercing him to surrender himself to the heart's dreadful embrace. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows behind John, a woman with wild, disheveled hair and a gaze filled with unyielding determination. It was Sarah, a fellow archaeologist and his closest companion on the expedition. She had managed to descend into the chasm, defying the overwhelming fear that gripped the others. "Spare yourself, John." Sarah's voice cut through the ethereal whispers, her words laden with desperation. "Can't you see? This thing, it's a parasite, a devourer of souls. It promises power, but only brings ruin." John's wavering resolve began to falter as he glimpsed the truth within Sarah's eyes. He withdrew his hand, the connection severed, the heart reacted with a thunderous bellow, its pulsations turning erratic and violent. Sarah grabbed John's arm, pulling him away from the abominable heart and urging him to ascend the rope, back toward the surface. They climbed frantically, each movement fraught with the overwhelming sense that they were being pursued by an unseen malevolence. As they neared the surface, the ground quaked violently, sending shockwaves through the ice and snow. The abyss convulsed, disgorging a horrific monstrosity, a grotesque amalgamation of sinew, bone, and pulsating flesh. Its many-eyed visage glowed with an otherworldly radiance, and its tentacle-like appendages thrashed violently, seeking prey. Sarah and John reached the surface just as the abomination breached the icy barrier. They stumbled backward, gasping for breath, their eyes widening in horror at the sight before them. The creature let out an unholy screech, piercing their eardrums and causing the surrounding landscape to crack and crumble. Then, with an unexpected burst of energy, the creature imploded, its form disintegrating into a cloud of black mist. The shockwave from its demise knocked John and Sarah off their feet, but they emerged relatively unscathed. Breathing heavily, the two survivors watched as the chasm closed before them, sealing away the heart and the unspeakable horrors it represented. They were left with only a desolate, scarred landscape as a haunting reminder of the darkness they had narrowly escaped. But as John and Sarah looked at each other, a realization dawned. The heart was not destroyed. It was merely contained, biding its time in the depths of the earth, waiting for another opportunity to ensnare unsuspecting souls. Ellen, a young woman in her 20s, worked the graveyard shift at Mercy Hospital. The only available bus ran until midnight, forcing her to trek back home through the dimly lit, desolate urban maze of New York City. Her apartment was 6 blocks away, but those blocks felt like miles under the moonless sky. One particular night, after a long and grueling shift, she felt the air was heavier than usual. There was a tension she could not shake off, a sensation of being watched. She looked back down the path she'd come from and saw nothing but an empty road bathed in sporadic lamplight. Then, from the shadowy alleys, a man emerged. At first, he was just a silhouette, a shifting shape amid the darkness. But as he stepped into the light, she could see his sunken eyes, hollow cheeks, and a strange, twisted smile. His gaze was fixed on her, making her blood run cold. He started to follow her, matching her steps, his silhouette stretching and morphing under the flickering streetlights. Part 2. The sinister pursuit. In fear, she quickened her pace, but the sound of his footsteps only grew louder. Her heart pounded in her chest as she began to run, her breath hitching. She could feel him closing in on her, his presence a haunting echo that resonated through the empty street. She darted down alleyways, her heels clattering against the wet asphalt. Yet he continued to pursue her, his panting growing more excited with every corner she turned. His footfalls echoed through the quiet streets, growing in intensity until they were the only thing she could hear. The city was silent, and in its silence, his pursuit became even more terrifying. Part II. The final showdown. Finally, Ellen reached her apartment building, its looming facade bathed in the glow of a solitary streetlight. The relief was short-lived. She fumbled with her keys, her trembling hands barely managing to push the key into the lock. His heavy footsteps were getting louder, closer. Sweat trickled down her spine as the echo of the shoes crunching gravel quickened. She was just about to push open the door when she felt his breath on her neck, heard a soft, guttural chuckle. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. In a sudden burst of adrenaline, she spun around, her hand reaching into her pocket and retrieving a small canister of pepper spray. She released it right into his face. He howled in agony, his hands clawing at his eyes. Part IV. The dawn of safety. Before he could recover, Ellen bolted through the entrance, slamming the heavy iron door behind her. She heard him pound against it, his screams reverberating through the cold night air. She collapsed against the door, her body shaking, her breath coming in short gasps. Suddenly, the apartment building was filled with flashing red and blue lights. The neighbors, alarmed by the commotion, had called the police. Ellen watched through the peephole as they apprehended the man writhing on the ground, blinded and disoriented. As they cuffed him, she allowed herself a small sigh of relief, her body finally beginning to relax. As the sun peeked over the horizon, bathing the city in a warm glow, Ellen realized her nightmare was over, though she knew she would never forget the chilling echo of those footsteps. It was a Tuesday evening in Derby, Vermont, and Jacob Shaw, the town's gruff but well-liked sheriff, was finishing his shift. The night was a shroud of ink, only interrupted by a sliver of moon and the occasional blink of far-off stars. The town was so quiet, you could hear the icy wind whispering against the leaves, rustling stories of the past. One such story had been on Jacob's mind for weeks, an old Inuit legend his grandmother used to tell him about a malevolent spirit, a Wendigo, a soul eater that was once human but transformed after a terrible act of cannibalism, driven by insurmountable hunger and harsh winter. The story had seemed just a folklore tale until a series of inexplicable occurrences began to shake the sleepy town of Derby. Livestock had been found gutted, bodies stripped to the bone, that remained scattered across Snow Street pastures. Then, people began disappearing, vanishing from their homes without a trace. The town was in a grip of fear, whispers of the Wendigos circling like a chilling breeze. Jacob wasn't one to believe in such myths, but the strange events had even him questioning his steadfast logic. He had found strange tracks near the sites of the attacks, human-like, but with elongated footprints, a haunting echo of a creature that should not exist. As he was about to head home, a frantic call came through his radio. "Sheriff, it's the Johnson farm. Something's there." He revved up his pickup and drove down the winding roads, the tires squealing against the frost-kissed asphalt. The Johnson farm was a sad sight. The fields lay barren and the once vibrant farmhouse now a decrepit husk. As he arrived, he saw Ed Johnson, the family's patriarch, outside holding a shotgun, his eyes wide with terror. His gaze was fixed on the barn. Inside, the scene was harrowing. The Johnsons' cattle were ripped apart, their bodies ravaged with an intense, savage hunger. But that wasn't what froze Jacob's blood. The Wendigo stood there, a horrific blend of beast and man. Its emaciated body towered over him, its skin stretched so tight over the skeletal frame that it seemed transparent. Its eyes, sunken deep in their sockets, burned with a baleful, unending hunger. It opened its mouth, revealing rows of sharp, blood-stained teeth, letting out a haunting wail that chilled Jacob's soul. Time seemed to stop. He could feel his heart pounding against his chest, his instincts screaming at him to flee. But he was the sheriff. He couldn't run. Pulling out his service revolver, he fired at the beast, the loud bang echoing in the barn. The bullets hit the Wendigo, but it barely flinched, the wounds on his body healing as quickly as they appeared. Its gaze never left Jacob, a predator locking onto his prey. Ed appeared at the barn door, his shotgun in hand. With a terrified yell, he unloaded both barrels at the Wendigo. But like before, the wounds healed almost instantly. The Wendigo turned its attention to Ed, and with a speed that belied its size, it lunged at him. "No!" Jacob cried out, but it was too late. The Wendigo was upon Ed, and then Ed was no more. Jacob, in desperation, remembered an old part of his grandmother's tale. "It feeds on flesh, but craves the soul," she used to say. "To defeat it, you must offer it a soul it cannot resist." In a bold, almost suicidal move, Jacob locked eyes with the Wendigo and opened his mind to the beast, inviting it into his soul. The Wendigo hesitated. Its hunger-filled gaze faltered. For a moment, it seemed to human, a twisted mirror of what it once was. Then it lunged at Jacob. As the world around him faded, he felt an immense pain, but he held on, his mind tethered to the beast. They tumbled into a strange space, a battle of wills in the eerie darkness of the Wendigo's soul. Jacob saw its memories, its transformation, the countless lives it had taken. With a surge of determination, Jacob pushed back, his resolve becoming a beacon in the dark. He felt the Wendigo weaken, its hunger slowly fading. Then, with one final push, he severed the connection, returning to the physical world. He found himself back in the barn, the Wendigo gone. Ed was still dead, but the terror was over. The Wendigo was no more, but in its place, Jacob was left with a haunting memory, a piece of the creature forever etched into his soul. He had survived the Wendigo, but at what cost? As he stared at his hands, now trembling, he wondered whether he had defeated the beast or merely taken its place. The echoes of its hunger stirred within him. The town was safe, but the true horror, he realized, had just begun. The smell hit me first. Decades of rust and decay met with the pungent reminder of oils long dried and gears long seized. The mammoth, decaying industrial complex stood like a relic from a forgotten era, a chilling testament to the history of violence it had harbored. As a master mechanic with a soft spot for antique machinery, I, Jack Halsey, had made a career out of restoring old factories. But this factory had a sinister reputation. Everyone in the small town of Hanford would speak about it in hushed, trembling whispers. They said it was cursed, haunted by a psychopathic killer who made it his lair. One crisp June evening, I found myself staring at the monstrous structure, the dim twilight giving it an even more eerie outlook. The story was, the previous owners had hired some deranged ex-con for maintenance who, after being fired, swore bloody vengeance. They found bodies, gruesomely dismembered, strewed across the factory floors, some stuffed into rusty boilers or tossed into vats of chemicals. They never caught him, and the factory was abandoned. "Jack, don't go there," they said. But logic is a stubborn master. It was the perfect project to establish myself as the premier restoration mechanic in the region. Overriding my fear with ambition, I packed my toolbox, picked my courage, and stepped into the complex. The atmosphere inside was palpably dense, oppressive even. It felt as though the shadows themselves clung to me, seeping into my very pores. I descended into the factory's belly, every crunch of my boots on the gravelly floor echoing ominously. I tried to focus on the task at hand, examining the monstrous boilers, the twisted pipes, and the corroded machinery became a welcome distraction from the eerie silence. Then I heard it, the softest creak, a barely audible shuffle. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Was it just my imagination playing tricks? I spun around, flashlight in hand. Nothing. Shaking it off as paranoia, I continued my work. A blood-curdling scream sliced through the silence. It echoed in the vastness of the factory, bouncing off the cold metal walls, growing louder, intensifying. I felt the hairs on my neck stand as a shiver ran down my spine. The scream had come from deep within the factory. Panic started to creep in, wrapping its cold, skeletal fingers around my heart, but I couldn't let it consume me. Thinking on my feet, I rummaged through my toolbox, pulling out an old wrench. My palms were sweaty, but my grip was steady. I had to be resourceful, using the knowledge of the complex layout I gathered. I quietly moved, sticking to the shadows, my wrench my only ally in the cavernous factory. Another scream pierced the night, this one closer. My skin crawled as I peered around a rusty column to see a horrifying sight. A man, covered in grim and filth, was hunched over a makeshift operating table. His eyes held a twisted glint, a sickening smile etched on his face. A blood-soaked apron clung to his body as he hummed a haunting tune, relishing in the horrifying act. Fear bubbled inside me, the grotesque image etching itself into my mind. But there was no time for fear. Survival was paramount. I tried to remember the blueprints of the factory, looking for a way out. My hands shook, adrenaline pumping through my veins. Suddenly, the man turned his head. Our eyes met, a predatory glint flashing in his. Panic exploded within me, yet I had to maintain my composure. I took a deep breath, pulling together all my courage. I darted across the factory floor, his maniacal laughter echoing behind me. My heart pounded in my ears as I raced through the labyrinth of rusty machinery. I had to be smarter, faster, if I hoped to survive. I remembered a hidden exit in the blueprint, a forgotten chute used for discarding scrap. I sprinted towards the chute, praying it was operational. The killer was right behind me, his heavy footfalls matching my racing heartbeats. With a final surge of adrenaline, I jumped, sliding down the chute towards the uncertain darkness. The chute spit me out into the cold night. Panting heavily, I looked back at the decaying factory, its ominous silhouette against the moonlit sky. The night was pierced again by the maddening laughter, chilling me to the bone. I stumbled to my feet, sprinting away from the cursed complex. The experience was horrifying, leaving me shocked and traumatized. It was a grim reminder of the evil that can lurk in forgotten corners, within rusting metal and beneath peeling paint. Yet I survived. I used my wit, my skill, and sheer determination to escape the clutches of a psychopathic killer. I am Jack Halsey, the mechanic who lived to tell the tale of the cursed factory. But Hanford would forever remember it as the eerie legend of the corroded colossus. The skyline of the city was dominated by massive structures, but tonight, one tower stood out less than the others. The towering office building I worked in was enshrouded in an abyss of darkness, its glass and steel facade blending into the obsidian night. Lights from neighboring skyscrapers failed to penetrate its opaque visage. But inside, one of the top floors was still dimly illuminated. There, a single desk light pooled its glow on stacks of papers and an exhausted worker, me. Another project with an impossible deadline meant burning the midnight oil. And so, once again, I found myself working late, wrapping up the intricate designs of my latest architectural project. The muffled hum of the HVAC system was the only sound accompanying the soft scribbles of my pen. With each passing hour, the office had emptied out, leaving behind only the ghost of echoed footsteps and hushed conversations. Finally, the ornate clock that I had inherited from my grandfather signaled that it was midnight. Its chimes were both a comfort and a reminder that the world outside still moved at its normal pace. Rubbing my tired eyes, I decided to call it a day. Packing up my things, I began my lonely journey to the underground parking lot, using the elevator's descent as a moment of reflection and transition from work mode to the anticipation of home's warmth. Reaching the parking level, the atmosphere shifted. The once bustling space during the day now exuded an eerie silence. The dim overhead lights did little to stave off the shadows that clung to the corners. Rows of cars stood like silent sentinels, their polished surfaces reflecting the feeble luminescence. Unlocking my car, I was enveloped by its familiar scent and comfort. But as I settled in and adjusted the rearview mirror, my heart catapulted into my throat. There was a shadowy figure, a man sitting in the back seat. His eyes, cold and calculating, met mine through the mirror. "Drive," he ordered, voice as sharp as shattered glass. My body went rigid, each nerve ending screaming of the imminent danger. But the paralysis of fear was momentarily overridden by the primal need for self-preservation. Without a word, I obeyed, guiding the car through the spiraling exit of the garage, each turn echoing with the weight of dread. As the city's skyline unfolded before us, his directives became evident. He was guiding me away from the comforting neon lights and bustling streets. Instead, we ventured deeper into the city's underbelly. Each turn took us further from familiarity and closer to the desolation of the old warehouse district, a testament to a time when industry thrived here. "Stop here." His voice broke the monotonous hum of the car's engine. Obediently, I pulled over next to an abandoned warehouse, its windows long shattered and walls scarred with graffiti. The heaviness of the situation pressed down on me. Summoning a voice that I hoped didn't betray my fear, I asked, "Why? Why me?" He leaned forward, the scant light from the dashboard revealing a face that had seen its share of battles. "I need something," he murmured. Panic swirled, laced with confusion. "What? Money? My wallet's in the glove compartment. Take it." A chuckle, cold and mirthless, slipped from his lips. "Not what? Who? But it seems there's been an error." The revelation didn't bring relief. It intensified the fear. An error? Then why am I here? "Unfortunately, you've seen me, and that's a problem." Time seemed to slow. My mind raced through scenarios, calculating the odds. The key was in the ignition, but would I have the time to start the car and speed away? He seemed agile, and the car's confined space was a disadvantage. But as the saying goes, desperate times call for desperate measures. Mustering all my strength and courage, I lunged at him, using my body weight to push him hard against the door. The unexpected move caught him off guard. Capitalizing on this momentary lapse, I flung the door open and bolted into the night. The warehouse district was unfamiliar territory, a daunting maze of derelict buildings and winding alleyways. However, fear proved to be a powerful compass. In the distance, the glow of neon lights beckoned, leading me to a 24-hour diner. Bursting through the door, I frantically explained my ordeal to the few patrons and staff, urging them to call the police. The subsequent hours were a blur of questions, statements, and identification parades. The stranger was indeed a notorious enforcer for one of the city's most dangerous gangs. He was known for his ruthlessness, delivering messages of intimidation or worse. The real twist? I was never his intended target. It was just a cruel twist of fate that my car model matched his actual objective for the evening. There was a long pause. We could hear our collective hearts beating rapidly. Paranoia set in. Was he truly lost, or was there something more sinister at play? Mia, the most pragmatic of us, asked, "How did you find this place?" He hesitated, then replied, "I was hiking. Got lost. Saw the lights." Something about his response didn't sit right. It was too vague, too rehearsed. The conversation was cut short when we heard a rustling behind him. To our horror, more figures emerged from the woods, all with the same hooded appearance. Fear gripped me. We were outnumbered. Peter, thinking quickly, grabbed a log from the fireplace, its flames licking the air. "Stay back," he shouted. The hooded man looked at his companions, then back at us. His gaze softened. "We didn't mean to frighten you. We're hikers. We got caught in an unexpected storm, lost our way. We saw the light from your cabin." Relief washed over me. The situation seemed less threatening now. After a quick discussion, we decided to let them stay in the barn a little distance away from the cabin. As dawn approached, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside. I peered out of the window. The barn was empty, and the hikers were gone. Curiosity got the best of me, and I went to inspect the barn. What I found inside wasn't sinister but puzzling. Spread across the floor were a multitude of wildflowers arranged in beautiful, intricate patterns. In the middle, there was an aged leather journal. The journal was a memoir of a man named Jonathan who had lived during the early 1900s. He had built the very cabin we were staying in as a tribute to his late wife, Ilara. The entries spoke of his profound love for her and how he built the cabin as a place for them to cherish their memories. Ilara loved wildflowers, and he would often create patterns with them to make her smile. The last entry was dated 2 days before our visit. It read, "To whoever finds this, we are the descendants of Jonathan. We return every year to pay tribute to our great-grandmother Ilara. The patterns are for her. We meant no harm and only wanted to honor the love story that unfolded in this very cabin. We apologize if we scared you, but some traditions are too precious to give up." The realization that we had been part of a century-old ritual was both eerie and beautiful. We left the cabin later that day, leaving the wildflower patterns undisturbed, a silent acknowledgement of Jonathan and Ilara's timeless love. The cabin was a masterpiece of solitude. Nestled deep within the dense pine forest, it was a world away from the bustling streets of our college town, the perfect retreat for my friends and I, a place where we could forget about exams, deadlines, and responsibilities. As I looked out from the front porch, the setting sun cast long shadows over the undulating landscape. The vibrant hues of twilight painted the sky, juxtaposing against the dark silhouette of the trees. It was our first evening there, and the serenity of it all was almost intoxicating. Inside, Sarah was preparing dinner while Peter and Mia were entangled in a fierce battle of card games. Laughter echoed through the walls, creating a warm, homely feeling. Night had fallen by the time we sat down for dinner. The cabin was illuminated by soft candlelight and the flickering flames from the fireplace. With our bellies full and spirits high, we settled into the living room for some light-hearted conversation. That's when it happened, a soft, hesitant knock on the cabin door. We looked at each other, a hint of confusion evident in our eyes. "Who could that be?" Sarah whispered. There was no reason anyone should be here. We were miles away from civilization, and I hadn't told anyone about this place apart from the group. I rose from my chair, caution pushing my feet towards the door. Every footstep felt heavier than the last, with anticipation building inside of me. The wooden floorboards creaked under my weight, adding to the unsettling atmosphere. I peered through the peephole, but all I could see was darkness. "Who is it?" I asked, trying to hide the tremble in my voice. There was no response. I considered opening the door, but a heavy hand rested on my shoulder. "Let's just ignore it. Might be some wild animal or the wind," Peter whispered. His brave facade couldn't hide the unease in his eyes. But the knock came again, louder this time. More persistent. There was a sense of urgency, a desperate need. I reached for the doorknob, but Maya stopped me. "Let's look through the window first," she said. We moved to the window, peeling the curtain back just a fraction. To our horror, a man stood at our doorstep, his face hidden by a hood. He looked lost, his clothes tattered and torn. He didn't knock again, but we could see he was muttering something to himself, a constant eerie chant that we couldn't quite decipher. Sarah, ever the kind-hearted one among us, suggested we at least ask if he needed help. He could be lost or hurt, she reasoned. Against my better judgment, I opened the door just a crack. "Can we help you?" I asked. The man looked up, revealing deep-set eyes that carried tales of sorrow. "I'm lost," he whispered. "I need shelter for the night. I promise I'll leave by dawn." As a jogger in my late 30s, my daily early morning run through the quiet neighborhood was part of a routine, a sacred ritual that I held dear. But that fateful morning held a terror I never could have foreseen. The sky was a patchwork of menacing dark clouds, casting long, spectral shadows that seemed to harbor a malevolent force. The wind howled through the skeletal trees like whispers of long-forgotten tales of horror. Everything was unusually still, the silence eerie and discomforting. It felt as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something dreadful to unfold. My feet rhythmically hit the pavement, the sound echoing through the silent street. That's when I noticed it. A strange, rusty growling sound that seemed to rise and fall with the gusts of wind. Dismissing it as a trick of the wind, I continued my run, but the unsettling growl stayed with me, growing louder and more persistent with each step. Then I saw it, a hulking figure lurking at the edge of the street, its eyes reflecting the dim streetlight. It was a stray dog, massive and menacing. unlike any I had seen before. Its mangy fur was slicked back, revealing a mottled skin that seemed to writhe and pulse in an unholy manner. Its eyes, however, were what terrified me the most. They were an unnatural crimson, burning with a terrifying, insatiable hunger that made my blood run cold. A guttural growl escaped its throat, and I knew in that moment that I was its prey. Fear coursed through my veins, paralyzing me momentarily. Panic-stricken, I tried to remember every bit of advice I had ever heard about dealing with aggressive dogs, but my mind was a whirl of chaos. The air seemed thick, suffocating. The stray dog snarled, its lips curling to reveal yellow, jagged teeth, and I saw my impending doom reflected in its eyes. Summoning every ounce of courage, I slowly backed away, maintaining eye contact with the beast. My heart pounded in my chest like a frenzied drummer, the echoes seeming to punctuate the impending danger. I could feel the beast's anticipation, almost tasting its malicious delight in my fear. Just as the terror threatened to overwhelm me, a miracle happened. A stray cat darted out of the bushes nearby, its sudden movement catching the dog's attention. With a menacing snarl, the dog abandoned me, charging after the cat instead. I felt a surge of gratitude for the feline, even as I feared for its safety. With the beast momentarily distracted, I sprinted back home, my breath coming out in ragged gasps. I could hear the dog's snarls fading behind me as I ran, my heart threatening to burst out of my chest. I didn't stop running until I was safely inside my house, door securely bolted behind me. That morning changed my life. The quiet, serene neighborhood that I had loved now held a terror that haunted my dreams. I still go on my morning jogs, but I choose a different route, one that doesn't cross the path of that demonic stray dog. The terror of that encounter has etched a deep scar in my memory, a stark reminder of the day when a routine job turned into a horrifying nightmare. It's always the whir of engines that kicks my paranoia into gear. The turbine's hum lulls most into a false sense of security, a domesticated dragon of steel and fuel under the command of capable pilots. But to me, it sounds like a grotesque lullaby, sung by the mechanical Grim Reaper. My name's Leela, a 30-something solo traveler. Traveling is my job, my passion, and my curse. Today, I was on flight 113 from New York to London, a routine trip I had made countless times. I am a woman, yes, but fear is a stranger to me, and yet, today, I felt a frisson of unease crawl up my spine as I stepped onto the plane, a premonition of catastrophe. The journey began without issue. We reached cruising altitude, the seatbelt sign blinked off, and the cacophony of relaxed chatter echoed within the aluminum tube soaring above the Atlantic. Yet my heart drummed its own uneasy rhythm, matching the thrum of the engines outside. An hour into the flight, a series of loud thumps and vibrations jolted the plane. The cabin lights flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced in the corners of my eyes. The friendly hum of the engines transformed into a wail of distress. Panic gripped the cabin, a silent tidal wave of terror that swept from front to back, leaving white-faced, wide-eyed passengers in its wake. My pulse quickened. As a frequent flyer, I recognized the signs. Turbulence, possibly severe. I pulled the seatbelt tighter, my knuckles pale and trembling. The flight attendants, masking their own fear with a veneer of professionalism, advised everyone to remain seated and buckled. A tense silence ensued, the hum of the engines now a monstrous roar in our ears. The plane started losing altitude rapidly. The stomach-churning drop felt like an elevator with cut cables. The calm, controlled voice of the pilot came over the loudspeaker, promising we were experiencing technical difficulties and that they were doing everything they could. The flight continued on, the minutes stretching into agonizing hours. Fear curdled into a horrifying realization that we might not survive. My mind darted to the cold, merciless Atlantic Ocean beneath us, but a kernel of hope was still kindled in my heart, refusing to be extinguished. Suddenly, a man in the adjacent row, a mechanic by trade, raised his voice, breaking the silent tension. He had overheard the crew's radio chatter. He explained the situation with a calm, practiced air. Both engines had malfunctioned, but the pilots were trying to execute a rare but doable procedure, a glide approach, relying on the plane's aerodynamics and minimal engine power to keep us in the air. His calmness was infectious. Even as we experienced frequent drops and unnerving shakes, we clung to his words. Over the intercom, the pilot confirmed our worst fears and greatest hope: an attempted water landing. Fear was a bitter taste in our mouths, but it was balanced by the strange sense of relief that someone was fighting for our survival. The descent was terrifying. The plane rattled and screamed against the forces of nature. The flight attendants guided us through the emergency procedures, their voices shaky but strong. Everyone was silent, preparing for the impact. The crash was shockingly smooth. The plane kissed the surface of the water, the belly of the beast skidding along the waves. The cabin jolted, luggage tumbled, and screams echoed. Then, as quickly as it began, it was over. The plane bobbed gently on the open sea, an improbable lifeboat. Rescue was swift. A commercial ship not far from our location reached us in under an hour. As we huddled on the ship's deck, watching the dying day paint the sky with hues of blood and fire, I realized the absurdity of our survival. The uncanny odds, the impeccable execution of an almost impossible maneuver, the proximity of a rescue ship. The emotional roller coaster left me spent. Fear, horror, and paranoia had coursed through my veins, only to be replaced by relief and shock at our unlikely survival. I looked at the silhouette of our half-submerged airplane in the dying light, a symbol of our harrowing ordeal and a testament to human resilience. From then on, the whir of engines sings a different lullaby to me. It's a reminder that life is fragile, precarious, and unpredictable, but also remarkably tenacious, resilient, and full of miracles. The pallid glow of the moon shone wanly through the skeletal branches above me, illuminating the lonely stretch of highway on which I found myself stranded. The dampness of the late-night air clung to my skin, an echo of the concert I was returning from. A last hurrah, a semblance of normalcy before the world became quiet again. My car, a symbol of my erstwhile freedom, was now a dead piece of metal on the road, devoid of life. The check engine light had flashed on just moments before the engine choked, sputtered, and surrendered to a deathly silence. I was miles from home and surrounded by darkness, save for the wan moon above. In the middle of nowhere, the echo of my high heels on the asphalt was the only sound for miles, punctuating the otherwise pregnant silence. I nervously checked my phone. 1 bar, just 1 bar of signal left. I could call a tow truck, I thought, trying to suppress the rising wave of panic that threatened to consume me. I dialed the number, waited, and heard the disconnected tone. Just as I was about to surrender to despair, the sound of a distant engine hummed into my awareness. Hope surged in my chest as I saw the headlights growing brighter in the distance. A small prayer escaped my lips as I waved my hands, hoping to grab the driver's attention. The vehicle slowed, pulling over to the side of the road. It was an old model pickup truck, its faded red paint chipped and rusted in places. Out of it climbed a man, his lanky silhouette etched against the headlights. A chill ran down my spine, not of relief, but of an indefinable fear. The man was oddly dressed for a late-night drive, a faded red flannel shirt, greasy overalls, and boots covered in a mix of mud and what I hoped was red paint. His gaunt face was lined with age, and his eyes, a predatory gleam shone within them. "I reckon you need some help, miss," he said, a toothy grin unfurling on his leathery face. "Yes, thank you," I managed, forcing a grateful smile. He examined my car, whistling lowly under his breath. "I can tie your car to my place. Got all the tools to fix her up," he said, the words hanging heavy in the air. His offer was my only escape, and I felt the grip of terror tightening around me. But trapped between the devil and the deep blue sea, I had little choice. The journey was painfully long. His house was nestled deep in the woods, away from prying eyes. The building loomed in the darkness, its darkened windows like hollowed eyes. He led me inside, and the place was a horror show in itself. The scent of rot hit me first, followed by the sight of taxidermy animals with their glassy eyes scattered around the dimly lit room. The The sight of them, still and silent, their lives halted mid-scream, sent a wave of disgust through me. "Sit down. I'll go check on your car," he said, leaving me in that grotesque mausoleum. The fear in me was now palpable, twisting my stomach in knots. My mind was a whirlwind of horrifying possibilities, but I reminded myself I had to survive, and survival meant escape. I made a run for the door, pulling at it with all my might. It was locked. Footsteps behind me made me turn. He was standing there, a wicked grin on his face. His eyes glinted with a perverse delight. Running so soon. In a surge of adrenaline, I flung the nearest thing I could find at him. It was a heavy ashtray, and it hit him square in the face. He staggered, blood running down his face as I sprinted past him, heading for the garage. I got into the pickup truck, praying the keys were in it. Luck was on my side. The engine roared to life just as I saw him stumbling out of the house, clutching his bleeding face. I floored the gas and drove off, leaving the house of horrors behind. I arrived at the nearest town by dawn. The people there were kind, their faces reflecting the horror of my story. I was safe. I cooperated fully with the authorities, leading them back to the house that was etched permanently into my memory. The tension was palpable when the police, their faces grim and set, surrounded the building. I could only watch, my heart pounding in my chest, as they stormed inside. Moments later, they emerged, dragging him out in handcuffs. The sight of him was as terrifying as ever, even shackled and outnumbered. His eyes met mine, and that wicked grin once again crossed his face. But this time, I didn't cower. I held his gaze, refusing to be the victim any longer. In the end, they found the tools of his horrifying trade, along with my car still parked in the garage. Evidence of his vile deeds was discovered, enough to put him away for life. The chilling news of his arrest made headlines. The man who preyed on stranded motorists was now confined to a cell. His reign of terror finally ended. The rhythmic hum of tires on the highway and the mellow croon of a late-night radio show was the only solace I found as I drove back from a friend's party. The evening was late, and a light fog danced over the road, adding an eeriness to the already dim night. The party had been a last-minute decision, and in retrospect, maybe not the best one. I was exhausted, the events of the night playing like a repetitive montage in my mind. Highway 56 was notorious for being desolate, especially this late. However, a blinding flash of red and blue lights broke my reverie. My heart started racing as the police siren wailed behind me. Cursing under my breath, I wondered if I had maybe been driving too fast without realizing. I pulled over, fingers trembling slightly. Though I hadn't had a drink at the party, the sudden appearance of a cop had my nerves spiking. Peering in the rearview mirror, I watched as a tall figure stepped out of the police cruiser, the fog swirling around his boots. There was something immediately off about him. The uniform was not like the ones I'd seen on other officers. It seemed slightly baggy, and his badge, even from this distance, looked tarnished. My paranoia began to grow when I noticed that his police cruiser lacked the typical markings. As he approached my window, the dim light illuminated a rough-looking face, hidden partly behind an unkempt beard. "Evening, ma'am," he grunted, his voice gravelly. "License and registration, please." While I complied, I couldn't help but notice his eyes, cold, devoid of the typical professional warmth you'd expect. There was something predatory about them. The radio on his shoulder didn't emit any typical police chatter. "Why did you pull me over, officer?" I managed, trying to keep my voice steady. He took his time, examining my papers. "You seem to swerve a little back there. Have you been drinking tonight?" I shook my head quickly. "No, sir, just tired." He peered into the back of the car, his gaze lingering longer than I was comfortable with. "All alone tonight?" The very question sent shivers down my spine. "My boyfriend's expecting me," I lied, hoping to deter any ideas he might have. He leaned in closer, the faint smell of stale cigarettes assaulting my nostrils. "You should be careful, driving this late. It's not safe for a young woman like you." Despite my rising fear, my instincts kicked in. "Thank you, officer. I'll be sure to remember that. Can I go now?" He took a long pause, then finally handed back my papers. "Drive safe," he murmured, but there was no concern in his voice, just an underlying threat. The instant he walked away, I sped off, not caring about any speed limits. My heart raced, and the fog seemed thicker, but I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched. About 10 minutes later, another blinding flash of lights filled my mirrors, the same red and blue. Panic flooded me. I dialed 911 on my phone, keeping it on speaker. 911, what's your emergency? I think I'm being followed by a fake cop on Highway 56. He pulled me over once, and now he's behind me again. My voice was on the edge of hysteria. The operator's voice was calm. Stay on the line. We're tracking your location. We don't have any units dispatched in that area. The words felt like a punch in the gut. The siren wailed louder, and the cruiser edged closer. Take the next turn off, the operator said. It should be a rest area in about 2 miles. We'll have officers waiting for you there. Every second felt like an hour. I pushed my car faster, praying the rest area would appear. Just as despair threatened to engulf me, I saw the sign. As I turned off, I saw 2 police cruisers waiting. The fake cop's car screeched to a halt behind me, but he didn't get out. After what felt like an eternity, the 2 real officers approached my car. You're safe now, one of them said, his face filled with genuine concern. It took months to shake off the paranoia, but the one thing that haunted me the most was the realization that if I hadn't trusted my instincts and called for help, I might not have made it home that night.